So Peterson's, the thing is, he's forming the bridge. The bridge we're missing is that he's not coming out with Stoicism. We're missing that guy in the middle that's actually saying what needs to be said. I thought he would do that. When I read his first book, I'm thinking he's going to get there. I think he might be able to do it, because what the world is really asking for today is Stoicism. But nobody can figure out how to reconstruct it. Peterson's actually pretty close. Like where Buddhism is don't take responsibility, Stoicism is take responsibility for what you can act on. And then, of course, Arianism is take responsibility for fucking everything and get your hands on. What's Christianity? Christianity is saying it's really a female means of responsibility evasion outside of your domain. So we have this spectrum. You need a methodology that suits the amount of responsibility you can handle. One of our vulnerabilities is Christian universalism. We have to get over that, and because nobody else thinks that way but us. People who share universalism are only competitors. People who don't share universalism are enemies. We don't have enemies because Christian forgiveness is a means of converting people from non-cooperators to cooperators. It doesn't necessarily convert them from enemies to cooperators. It was about obtaining power to destroy Western civilization. It's always been about that. Now, Christians don't want to deal with it. What the hell do you think Christianity was about? It was the Byzantines learning from the Jews how to undermine Western civilization by rallying the bottom against the top. What did we get? We got a dark age out of it. Look what it took to reconstruct Europe. We're not done yet. 1,500 years. And we're not done yet. We didn't restore where we were in the first century until after Napoleon. What we've shown is the minute you get there, you get the Antikythera mechanism and you get Babbage. Now start thinking about that. How long did it take to get Babbage after Napoleon recreated the state? A generation? We had the Antikythera mechanism, God knows, around the first century. There's no reason we didn't have that except for Christianity. Now, Christianity did solve the problem for the underclass. I'm not beating it up entirely. I'm beating up the development of the church as a political order, not Christianity as a personal religion. As a personal religion, it doesn't get better. It just doesn't. That's just the science. Christianity is the optimum religion for producing a high trust polity that's action oriented. I'm a Jeffersonian. Take what the man said, whether you think it's philosophy or theology or simply science mythologized, doesn't make any difference to me because it's true under all three conditions. It's all the crap that the church wove around it to create the Bible as a book of law, to create the church as a government. That's what's the problem. I got taught German fairy tales. I didn't get taught the Bible, right? I'm a Catholic. I learned Germanic fairy tales because I lived in a German city. I learned in a Mennonite farm town full of German farmers. How many of our myths and legends are about being tricked? A lot of them. That's the core of our teaching, right? And so when you look at what these things are teaching you, you look at what Christianity is teaching you, it's like the two sides of the coin. You can go with being tricked and whatever, or you can go with it being obedient under threat. You can go either way. Serve God, be obedient. That's the feminine. Or you can go with be cunning, don't be tricked. Aesop's fables are basically, you can reduce it to law. Catholic dogma is effectively law. Well, they're decision criteria. And so the thing about religion is that it's an intuitionistic. You can associate with it easily.
Yes.
You don't need a great deal of knowledge to do it. So my view of Christianity is it doesn't matter if you're using the theological, the philosophical, the scientific description of it, because we're all making decisions by the same goddamn criteria. The only problem is when we're getting to arguing. Don't argue theology against science. Don't argue philosophy against science. What you do is you say, when philosophy fails, you go down to religion.
This is like this. It's rock, paper, scissors, okay? And
is.
Science always wins. It's just science is the ultimate answer if all else will fail.
Well, no. It's the other way around. It's that science has a narrower scope of decisions.
It's
And they're
very
not about,
specific.
they're just about what's true. That's all it tells you. Philosophy tells you what's good. Religion tells you what's good when you can't figure it out.
Religion is intuitionistic, which is to say it will give you the default.
Yes.
Philosophy requires thinking and work.
And science requires evidence. The thing about religion is it survived thousands of years of a very simple set of rules. Like many things in Western civilization require dualism. There's just this need for the faithful, the fundamentalist faithful, to not put science and faith on a scale that balance. And the answer is the science doesn't tell us what's good. It only tells us what's bad and false. It's up to the scripture to tell us what's good. Any scripture that survives the test of bad or false is true. It's true in the sense that that's the case. The problem is that people are simple and they want to have one thing they can understand.
Right.
It's easier to understand the faith at present than it is to understand the sciences. What I see is among the fundamentalists is like, I have a bigger dick than you, is that they're basing it on fundamentalism. I'm like, well, I mean, that's man's interpretation of the good. That's advice. But if there is a God, and I'm assuming there is, the laws are what he made, not what men said. But those laws only tell us what's bad and false. And unfortunately, the church has a couple of catastrophic falsehoods. One is that it doesn't recognize the inability to defeat all enemies. In other words, Christian love will not defeat all enemies. It only works if they're already predisposed to be an ally. In other words, there is more value in cooperating than not. So universalism is false. Christianity is an ethnic religion. Secondly, the value of all human life is only true to the point where it's harmful. In other words, there's a difference between care and suicide. And so the church's thing of be fruitful has an origin in it that is purely in order to tell the serfs that they need to have a lot of kids to keep the workload down. It isn't about spirituality or good. And we know all of those false claims of the church. What those two things are is responsibility evasion. I don't see anywhere where God says, be irresponsible. That's what Islam says. It's not what Christianity says. It's what the church said. So there's a difference between what the church says and what God says.
Right.
You know, Jesus comes along and says, you guys have got this wrong, because look what these people at the temple are doing, and look what the Romans are doing. If we want to maintain group cohesion for the underclass and not be turned into essentially serfs or slaves, in other words, be dictated to by the Persians or the Romans or the Greeks, then we have to find a way of unifying. And that way of unifying is love. But it's not unlimited. Whenever you say something's unlimited, you're saying you're not responsible. That's my complaint about Christians. Queen Margaret of Denmark said it best. It's very easy to tell the difference between principle and excuse. And an awful lot of Christians use the fact that the world is quite complex today as an excuse to avoid responsibility, which is fundamentally where I see us, is that they won't take responsibility. And that responsibility was held by the aristocracy and the men. Without the military aristocracy and the men and the universal militia, in other words, the need to produce men who can fight, the church becomes what it originally was intended to be, which is devolutionary, irresponsibility, politically irresponsible. It's like I said, if we're going to have a religion, let's have Christianity, because that's just the clearest one, and it's the most scientific one. I would prefer that we gave the option of looking at Christianity the three ways: theologically, philosophically, and scientifically. And I would prefer that we stopped having this problem of duality. In other words, we go back to deliver under God and deliver under Caesar, which is the law. I think that if we restored the military, we would go back to the church being the feminine balance to the masculine power. And so what we want is to return to the martial state, the libertarian government, and the Christian faith. And I don't mean that we have to be superstitious Christians for those of us who can't do it. There's philosophical Christians, because all you have to do to be Christian, the science says, is the natural law. I mean, which is really the silver rule. The silver rule when you don't know, and the golden rule when you do. It's really that simple. Exhausting kinship love to those who might be our allies, because they're only competitors. They're not enemies. The search for quality is the absolute worst fucking idea you can have. It's the worst evolutionary strategy you can have. Yet what does everybody do? Europeans didn't do that. We didn't. We didn't do it until Christianity. And we had a dark age. If you look at the Bronze Age collapse, they never came back, ever. We had to build civilization all over again. And that's where our religions came from, is trying to build civilization all over again. I keep making this statement to people, and it doesn't get across. By any measure, I'm a deist. I talk to God every fucking day. I pray. But the difference is, I don't pretend to know anything about God.
No, that's not your place, and it's not my place either.
And because I can't testify to it.
I just serve here.
I don't know. I don't listen to what other people say. I look at the evidence. The evidence is the laws of nature. That's the word of God. Then it happens to turn out that the common law looks a hell of a lot like the laws of nature. The Thomist project, as you've brought up, which is how I should frame it. Thank you for teaching me that's how I should frame it. I view my job as completing the Aristotelian, Augustinian, Aquinian, Smith-Hume project. I see myself as completing that effort to unite aristocratic empiricism with Christian love. Now, the difference is I might agree with you, but I can't say that in law. I can only say what I can testify to. So I might like this particular religious aspect or this particular dogma. I'm kind of fond of a lot of the Catholic Church dogma. But in the end, I'm trying to find the science of that unification of Athens and Jerusalem. I'm a deist. I'm a Jeffersonian. My view is whether God exists or not, I can't tell, but God works for me. It does. Not the Jesus thing doesn't, but the God thing does, or at least for me. And so I just look at it as, okay, well, I could only testify to being a deist because that's what I do. I perform. But as a scientist, I can't tell you whether I'm right or not about deism. I can only tell you I'm right about the laws.
Right.
And the benefits and harms that come from obeying or avoiding those laws. I do what I can testify to. It doesn't matter what else. My problem is, don't come and talk to me about the law with scripture. I can tell you if the scripture is true or not. In other words, if it's moral or not. And I can tell you most of it is pretty good. But when I get into law, I can't talk about what other men believe or have faith in. I can only talk about what's testifiable. I can only decide by the evidence of God's law, not the claims of God's law. You know, it's like, we know how the religion was created. We know how much time it took. We know enough things. Those truths are immaterial to the wisdom and the consequence of wisdom. If you state the metaphysics of Christianity, it's fucking trivial. If you state the metaphysics of Western civilization, it's really, really simple. The difference is you can't intuit them without a myth, without a narrative, without a history.
That's right.
You can't do it. And so the people who wrote those religious documents at the time, they knew they were manufacturing myth. But they did it like we do law. They're trying to do good because for the ancient world, you know, we forget how we don't have memories of what it's like to have people with an average 83 IQ. It means half of them are below that, right? We don't really get this whole problem of how do I make a lot of people do what's counterintuitive, which is love and trust one another despite all the evidence that they shouldn't.
Yep.
And so, I can reduce Christian metaphysics to 5 sentences, but you can't make people do it without the narrative because they have to feel it, not
That's right.
think it. In my world, if I talk from my emotional side, which I have one, it's just very weak and small and hidden in the dark. In my world, if you do the law correctly, then there is no difference between theology, philosophy, law, and science. There is no difference. It's just how much inflation you need in order to reach
That's right.
the inside. Well, the inside's actually in there, but you've got to feel it here, right? You've got to reach that inner engine that's sitting down there somewhere below our, in our brainstem, right? You've got to reach that so that that part of you can get the mindfulness that is necessary for us to feel safe enough to trust one another enough to produce the goods of cooperation at scale. I don't feel ready to go to the church yet. Of course, they've contacted me, but that petered out because of what they found out I was saying. No one will forgive me for going through my via negativas. I'm always going to be unforgiven for my via negativas, my prosecution of ideas. The Catholic Church is an institution. It's an institution that knows it needs to change. It's an institution with large enough scale and, frankly, enough revenues and enough capital assets and enough of political structure that if it changed, it could solve the problem. I'm not sure it can be done without divorcing the church into continents. In other words, just like we have an Orthodox church for that part of the continent, we have the Protestant church, the Catholic church for another part of the continent. We probably need to separate the churches of South America and of Africa and maybe even of Asia so that we can have different rules for different people.
So like a federal system.
Correct. If you think there's one way, it's part of this Christian oneness thing. We all need to be the same versus the pagan model of there's like a fucking saint for everything. There's a god of coffee cups. Well, it's like, well, who's Crispin? Saint Crispin. Agincourt was fought on Crispin's day. Saint Crispin, and he's like the god of tailors or something. I don't know, something, not God, the saint of tailors. But I mean, if you've got those things, those are archetypes.
Right.
Each archetype is a measurement. The more measurements you have, the more decidability you have by intuition. It's the same thing with economies. The more economies you have, the more ways you have of living. It's this oneness, like everybody's the same. The degree to which Westerners are infected with this thing as in Christianity and democracy is terrifying, where instead of saying the beauty is in the military distribution and hierarchy, where we all have duty and we all get respect for it as long as we do it, versus the peasantry or the clerisy who are supposed to be equal, but their only equality is in absolute poverty, which is where the idea comes from. Because every civilization acted to the Indo-Europeans the same way. That created the Axial Age religions. The Mediterraneans were successful, and they caused a counter-reaction of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Then you had the success of the Jews bringing Christianity in, both the Byzantines and the Jews. Then you had the successful replacement of Roman law and religion and empiricism and philosophy with Semitic superstition. Then we had 1,000-year dark age, and then the Muslims had turned fundamentalist, causing the flight of intellectuals out of Islam into the West. They brought with them the works that Christians had destroyed. Those works were distributed through mostly the Italians, and by 1200 they'd made it up to cause the Restoration movement in Europe. And then you get to the present problem. There's no way we're getting out of the fact that the Jewish method of warfare, the Abrahamic, the Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslim methods of warfare, which we take for granted are in fact methods of warfare. Christianity is built on the same set of lying and lying by the same means. So if we've already been conquered by it once, we have a natural permissiveness to letting it in. We let them in and they just evolved a new strategy again. They fight by undermining, and they can do it in the Jewish method of intellectual, or they can do it the Muslim method of religion. The thing about Christianity is it was subversive. But on the other hand, it wasn't harmful in producing a majority middle class society. And if you look at it, the good parts that were in Europeanism, Christianity doesn't conflict against. It just gave power to the underclass and women, virtue. So, the problem is Judaism is by definition a religion of warfare, just like Islam is. Judaism does it by undermining host populations, and Islam does it by occupying and transforming them and raiding them and conquer them. So they're both seditious religions. Freedom of religion can't be true for the simple reason that all religions are manifestations of a group evolutionary strategy, and all group evolutionary strategies are means of warfare. And instead, we brought in hostiles who rapidly took over our universities, suppressed all research into human differences, created the superstitious nonsense we call Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, anti-male feminism, PC, and then woke. And this is just a repetition of the Christian destruction of the ancient world, repeated by exactly the same means. They did the same thing. They undermined the culture. They undermined the class cooperations, they undermine marriage, they undermine the religion, they undermine the aristocracy, they undermine administration, they undermine the law, they destroyed the books, they destroyed the arts, they destroyed the literature. What's different between what the Jews did in the ancient world and what the Jews did in the modern world? You can't get away from that. What did the Muslims do? The Muslims doubled down on it, and they went to physical raiding. Of course, they were able to raid both civilizations and drag them down. And because it's a regressive religion, they eventually ran out of gas by 800, and by 1,000, they were going backwards again. And just as France, as an oppressor of Europe, had gone around and stolen everything that wasn't nailed down and created the Louvre, the Muslims stole everything that wasn't made down and created what they call their golden age. That's just like calling Napoleon's era a golden age. It's just fucking looting. And it wasn't anything contributory there. They pull out the few intellectuals that existed in the Muslim world as some great thing, but it's like you're at the crux of 4 continents with all the world trade going through there, and you can't produce an intellectual. It's statistically impossible that you wouldn't produce an intellectual under those conditions. Conversely, we had Christianity come into Europe, and we only produced a handful of pathetic intellectuals for hundreds and hundreds of years. So, the truth is what it is. And if God has a thing for anything, it's truth, and everybody else is a false prophet. I tend to look at it like my mother's side of the family is Catholic, and my father's, puritanical Protestant. Church of England type of stuff. When I look at that, I'm like, well, the Catholics thought they were doing good, but then it's a religion of the lower classes, and Protestantism is middle and upper classes. Then the flip side is there are superior aspects to Catholic religion, and there are superior aspects to Protestant religion. Which one of these is better isn't possible to ascertain without understanding both of them are good and bad. It's actually not the religion that matters. It's the responsibility that matters. And each of these things places responsibility on the scope of the material world differently. Is that part of the religion, or is that why the culture manifested a preference for one religion or the other? It's the latter. Religion isn't the cause. The variation in the religion is the consequence of the underlying tradition of responsibility. I mean, that's what these things do, is they trade responsibility for mindfulness.
My associate here in town, he Catholic trained, and it is just very impressive how he processes information different than I do.
I understood that it mattered when I went to college and I was in contract law class, and the professor, and he just looked at me and says, "You went to Catholic school."
That's awesome. It's just the sensitivity. He's like, it's obvious.
He's like, yeah, you can tell. Why? Because you don't realize that dogma is law. They're teaching you law. You just don't think of it that way. And it's an incredibly hyper-moral law that has tried to integrate the authority of the church, the love of Jesus Christ is producing the optimum peasant, and the Aristotelian and Platonic reason. You don't realize that that's what the church is doing. My problem is, God damn it, just say claim victory. Dear Pope, claim victory. I'm such the beneficiary of the Catholic Church, and I can see how aristocracy arises because it teaches you responsibility at every fucking level. It really does. It teaches you in a language that doesn't require you to understand abstract concepts. You don't understand logics and math. You just understand it as moral reasoning. And so, it's why I'm like, Jesus, why did you have to screw this up? You had it right.
Wait, Jesus didn't screw it up.
What?
Jesus didn't screw it up. Everybody afterward.
Right. Jesus. Even if I think the church itself was a bad idea, you got to remember what the aristocracy did is they appropriated the church. The church was just the sons of the aristocracy that couldn't hold land. They didn't want to break up the land. All the Catholic Church would need to do is to not only allow marriage, but to require it and to recruit from men of accomplishment instead of students, and to take P-Law and just tear apart woke and said, you've had your experiment listening to these people and look what's happened. They could easily resurrect the church. That whole tradition, they don't realize they've been fighting the same losing battle of institutional formation for so long. In other words, they've doubled down on doctrine that evolved for political reasons, not spiritual. And it has produced the opposite effect. Whereas if you just get men of means, the same reason I say the best evangelicals are the people who've come up from the bottom. They're not virtue signaling. They're bringing you what Jesus actually will save you from. They will actually bring you salvation. Whereas all these people, they go to divinity school and all this other stuff. They're not doing any good. They don't matter. I have a pretty clear knowledge because I have friends who went into the church. And I saw what that was all about and the kind of people that were there. They're not rulers. They're followers. They're not enabling the restoration of the church. They're managing its decline. Honestly, if I could go into the church, if there was a place for someone like me to go into the church, I would fucking do it. I'd give some fire and brimstone speeches, I tell you. I got some ancestors that were masters of that shit, and it comes naturally. I can't think of how many guys I know in their late 40s, 50s, or 60s that would devote the remainder of their productive life to giving back through a church that allowed them to. And it would eat the woke institution alive. Some Muslim professor today tried to claim that Western secularism is a religion. And I'm like, Abrahamic method of applying a pill, pull, and critique. He's a Muslim apologist trying to engage in sedition against secularism. And what is a religion? It's the false promise of freedom from the laws of nature in exchange for the mindfulness from having lessened your responsibility for learning and adapting to them. And in doing so, a religion produces a means of which you can conspire with others to equally avoid the problem of learning about the world and simplify your adaptation to it. That's what a religion does. And that's great for people who can't adapt and evolve and are limited. But it also has a consequence of limiting your involvement. What's secularism? It's a discovery, adaptation, and governance of the laws of nature to escape those people who engage in non-adaptation, non-evolution by evasion of the laws of nature and nature's God. So what he's trying to do is make a false equivalency by claiming a thing is the opposite of what it is. The reason for secularism is to escape supernaturalism. It's not a religion. Now you can say, is the American Constitution a religion? Well, we treat it as sacred in America, and we say that it's divine, but it's just natural law. It's science. The common law is empirical. It isn't theoretical. It isn't theological. It's simply empirical. The problem we're facing today is the Abrahamic method of deceit has been gone through the generations to the point where woke is its most recent incarnation. It's one thing to say the Abrahamic method is a means of social construction by which we provide mindfulness to children who will then evolve into rule-based and then to outcome-based ethics. In other words, it's a way of constructing the pyramid of complexity across the spectrum of ability over time. You can't teach children the kind of stuff we're talking about. They don't have enough context for it. You can teach children parables. And if you can't get beyond the parable, fine. The information's in the parables. So the Germans were more interesting because they're dutiful, good people. The Kantian revolution, the rationalist, and the phenomenalist revolution were simply attempts to create a non-central hierarchical central continuation of the Protestant strategy of every man has his own connection with God or whatever, but his own sovereignty. And so in that, they created an equivalent of the book that could be managed by the individual, which is a moral code that was secular. The Jews doubled down with Mendelssohn, which is they just reformed their law. If you read Jewish law by Mendelssohn, it's still polyethical and polylogical, in other words, still immoral, but it's well done. It's efficient. Throughout the history of the development of the natural law, either from secular or theological sides, we have seen the continuous conversions of Arianism, Aristotelianism, whatever, Europeanism, and Semitic thought, which is Christianity. We have seen this convergence happen on both sides as we try to reconcile the problem of providing mindfulness into the non-aristocratic classes or to the unempowered classes. We have providing mindfulness. Christianity provides mindfulness and virtue and positive feedback and prepares people for a middle-class majority civilization. It does all those things by providing this particular mindfulness, despite the fact that the high cost of European civilization is incredibly burdensome for them. In other words, we saw this sort of monotheism emerging in Roman civilization because there was clearly a need for a single system of measurement for all human behavior, instead of a system of measurement for the aristocracy and one for the peasantry and slaves. Unfortunately, the one the Romans had was superior, which was a benevolent sun god. However, it lacked the ability to create an institutional organization, and the church provided the Christian religion, like the Jewish religion, allowed a non-institutional form, in other words, of producing a power structure that could organize and somewhat resist the challenge of being powerless in an aristocratic civilization that gave great favor to those with upward mobility. So that convergence has happened. I just look at my work as the result of that convergence. The explanation is, if you're going to have the most rapidly innovative, adaptive, and evolutionary people and obtain the rewards of the continuous, recursive, rapid evolution, you're going to put increasing stress on the bottom. The only way the stress on the bottom can be alleviated is through the one resource they have, love. Because exhaustive forgiveness is the means by which you bait people into adaptation, into cooperation. That's why Christianity worked for the West. We had to Germanicize it a lot, and it went through a series of reformations, and eventually the church failed us. But the religion itself is in its original form, which is the Christianity is really so simple. It's just exhausting forgiveness. Exhausting, it doesn't mean it's endless. It just means exhausting forgiveness is the optimum solution to the prisoner's dilemma. You will eventually bait the enemy into cooperation. And what we forget as conservatives is we're completely unaware of how burdensome it is to self-regulate if you're a leftist. How hard it is to not just go with the herd, or how hard it is to take agency over yourself and responsibility for yourself, and how rewarding and fulfilling it is, and how safe it feels, and how spiritual it feels to run with the herd. Because that's what spiritualism is. It's running with the herd. That's what that feeling is. The feeling we call spiritual is the primitive mammalian response to the safety of running with the herd and the abandonment of the need for cognition and self-regulation while doing so. That's what spirituality means. When we're seeking spirituality, we're seeking the pure, simple animal evasion of responsibility, of self-regulation. We're giving ourselves up to the herd. Well, why do you think Christianity says surrender to Christ? It's so you surrender yourself to the herd. And what does love do? It tries to get you to practice the animal nature of the gregariousness of the herd. These are just primitive instincts that we may need to fulfill. But we have to understand is that these words we built on top of them are pseudosciences. They're mythologies on top of very simple behaviors that aren't wrong. In other words, when they're behaviors, they're not wrong, right? They're instincts as evolutionary necessities. And so you can't just tell people you have to ignore your evolutionary intuitions. Or we rapidly, because evolution is rare and costly, we rapidly stagnate. And then, as we can see in most of the world, we not only stagnate, we go backward. Because the fulfillment of the female intuition would be Islam, which is why everybody's afraid of Islam, is throughout history, is because it's so satisfying. It's basically heroin for the mind.
Marx was right. Is that what
Religion
you
is-
just said?
Well, religion is the opiate of the masses, but then again, but communism is just a secular religion.
We're pointing back to Mr. Darwin, okay? Because it's evolution. And it's like the fulfillment of the feminine intuition is denying Mr. Darwin his due.
The wonderful thing about their religion, this is why I'm so fond of polytheism, is that there's something for everybody. It's not trying to put you into this institutional mold like the Middle East is, or like we try to do in our education system with this false equality. It's like it used to be that we had saints of this and that. We forget how valuable that was, or gods and spirits of this and that. It's really valuable. We don't really think about how hard it is to internally reform when we evolved to conform to social pressure. By creating an external identity, you're creating a way for you to give up responsibility and to deform to the herd instead of self-monitor. So you're letting your instincts help you behave.
Yes.
This is why archetypes and heroes are so valuable. This is why I don't like monopoly anything, and especially monopoly religion. The right word is identity, polyidentity. But I like
It's who do you identify with? And
right. I mean,
how
so
you
who do I
identify-
imitate?
Yeah.
Who's my system of measurement that works for me? If Jesus had been added to the pantheon, it would have been perfect. If the Christians, it was really the Middle Eastern Christians, hadn't tried to resist the stoicization of Christianity, it would have been a flawless religion. But the minute you bring that Middle Eastern monopoly tyranny, seduction by false promise in, all of a sudden you haven't got a role model, you've got a political model. And that's the problem with Abrahamic religions. They're political religions.
This conversation today has allowed me to understand something which I did not understand before, which is how come the extreme left has no response to Islam is right about women.
Why?
It's because it's like it's the natural ultimate state of that feminine expression
It is.
as the state monopoly religion, political, the fusion of the political with the religious.
Islam says you're not responsible, Allah is. That's what it says. Jesus says, if you're a good Christian, I will forgive you. Those are two different things. You're still responsible, but you can be forgiven. Even if you fail, you're forgiven. I love that shit. I just love all that. I mean, if you understand Christianity as a philosophy, it's fucking brilliant. It's all the churchy shit that the Byzantines put in it that you just want to go back there and hang those people. The Middle East was really smart. This is the truth, is Judaism's a heresy of Greek thought, rabbinical Judaism. Christianity is a heresy of Judaism, and Islam is a heresy of Christianity. So what their original thing was 3 generations. It was 3 generations of this thought, which would have been fine. But the Byzantines had to go and try to turn it into European law, not wisdom literature. They turned it from culture into institution, which is what caused Islam to double down. Otherwise, what was the difference between Jews, Christians, and Muslims? I mean, it's all the same shit, right? So, excuse me, I didn't mean that derogatory.
No, that was Hebrew for discourse.
So I just look at it as, it would have been fine It's when you try to create authority out of wisdom. This is why I go back to, I just love the Indians. They didn't screw it up. I always said that Peterson was on the way
Right.
of producing Stoicism, and he was maintaining the Christian love within it, which I kind of liked, and especially his point of responsibility. But these are still very emotional statements. P-Law is going to give you the science, right, to be able, such that it may not be necessary to do all the Stoic rituals and woo-woo in order to get there. I think some people still need the woo-woo the way some people will need Christianity or Buddhism, right? They will need that because they're primarily empathic. Think of it, what's the difference between people are bots, I can't blame them, and I have to extend love to them?
It's not far.
It's not far, really. It's just the empathic versus the rational. You know, it's like if you're low agency and you're highly empathic, you need to have the ritual and the empathy. This is why I love Jesus. I submit to Jesus Christ. And the truth is, it works. It works especially if you've been busted. If these people who get alcoholics or drugs or
when they hit the bottom and bounce, man. It's like, yes.
There's no, Christianity is the thing, but a lot of people just need training to do that. Are you going to be able to train that person to be a rocket scientist or even do a good job? Maybe not. But you can turn that person to not be terrified and lonely in life. This is what's missing from the people throughout the church. Take the church and threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, the church has failed to do its duty, in my opinion.
Whereas your church today needs to have people trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. That's what it needs. It needs people who know the moral law, the P-Law. It needs people who help you with your finances. I don't mean help you like talk to you about your investments. I mean, they help you pay your bills, and if necessary, they pay your bills for you. They provide disputes between neighbors on manners, ethics, and morals.
It's like guardianship in a sense.
Exactly. There are a lot of people who need that. Instead, we took away the church, we took away the norms, we took away the traditions. We threw people into an education full of false promise that says you're going to fail unless your miraculous virtues that you were obviously born with equally to everyone else are able to come naturally into expression. Now, that rest construction of the church, the functions of the church, is something I've put in the Constitution. If you live in an area like Europe, which is one of the reasons they're more emotionally stable, Europeans are quite provincial in the sense that they don't move around as much as we do. And that's because the cities are older and lots of other things, but they're more provincial. So you can be within driving distance of your extended family and your town, right? Maybe even within walking distance. And so this family functions as that system. But the more Anglo you are, in other words, the more mobile you are, the more the church had to provide this. And so the church did provide this in the early American, right up until 1900. The church provided that family for you, despite the fact. That's where freedom of religion comes from. Freedom of religion doesn't come from tolerance for other religions. Freedom of religion comes from two forces. One is that the British believed that the church, taking the church into the state, depassioned the religion. The second was when all these people were moving from around England to the industrial heartlands, they needed more churches to solve this problem. So they didn't want to regulate who could have this church. They wanted factions. So you could have all those little Protestant churches that maintained the traditions. Well, even today, I won't say which is at the bottom. Well, why not? What's the really crazy church? The Seventh-day Adventists? There's a group, I think that's the name of a church, right?
That is the name of a church.
Right. And then you have the Church of England.
They're quite divergent in their function.
They're actually the opposite end of the spectrum. Do you know there's an IQ variation between every Protestant church all the way down? With the highest being obviously the Tories, and the lowest being the people who are more fundamentalist. And so that is the virtue of freedom of religion. It shouldn't mean freedom to be anything other than Christian. It just means that the Christian sects can produce whatever extended families they need to suit the needs of the demographic, just like I argue that you need polities to suit the needs of the demographics. So realize the origin of the socialist idea is Christianity. It's the church. And so when the lower classes got access to politics in France by killing off the middle class and the aristocracy, they applied the ethics of the church, which is a hierarchy, feminine, socialist. They're the ones who came up with socialism.
That's right.
Now, there are some things we want comforting stories, mother's stories about. In essence, Jesus's whole story is mother's story. It's here's how to feel good about the tragedy of the universe. I would prefer that you had a different story than that one, which is that you learned either the Buddhist or the Stoic or the responsibility version. But what if you can't? What if you literally can't? What if you can't take responsibility, gain agency over your life, or gain agency over your emotions? Well, you have to find something that lets people who have less agency and less training in agency to be able to function in that society by doing good and not harm, by means that their software can, but they need software they can run. Because women would put a package together for whatever they want. We would have restored what had happened under the church. The church provided that via positiva, femininity, in defense of the common. The church is basically a promise of non-aggression, which is what women operate under. And the church uses the promise of non-aggression in exchange for submission. In other words, the church uses seduction. It's the same thing with religions. Most religions, other than Christianity, are seditions. They're seditious. You want to have a religion in your head, fine. Doesn't mean you can have an organization, raise money, build temples or whatever they are, or organize in public. You don't have any right to sedition.
Right.
Either pay the tax or don't. The tax is a normative adaptation. A lot of things that people get away with are crimes. Our people didn't used to do them because it was just part of our metaphysics, right? It was bad manners. And the church suppressed the hell out of bad manners. I mean, Jesus. Fundamentally, church law was reduced to basically keeping good manners. And it did a great job of policing manners.
Yes, and Peterson talks about truth as well. And it is
well, except that he's
a
mess. There's two criticisms I have of Peterson. I want to say he's really, really, really good and valuable. My primary criticism is I am, of course, quite anti anything to do with the Abrahamic religions other than what Jesus said. If Jesus didn't say it, somebody else did.
That's what caused me to read the Bible in the first place. I said, I'm interested in what God said and what Jesus said. I'm not really interested in all the other bit, but the stories were kind of interesting. It was kind of cool.
And that's why this Thomism thing came up, because, of course, I think of myself as a Jeffersonian because my version of Christianity is the same as his. And I understand Christianity scientifically, and I treat Jesus as a philosopher. You want to get into divinity, I'm like, well, he's a divine expression. Fine. I don't have to have all this other stuff out there. But that's just because that's all I need. I just look at Christianity and say scientifically it solves the hard problem of cooperation scale. But I mean, when he brought up Thomism, I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, I always bring up Aquinas, but I never say that go look up Thomism, because the whole point there is it's God made the universe. If the science says that's what God said, then that's what God said. That's it.
The research I did, I read the Wikipedia entry on Thomism. It was an interesting read, and I found a lot of resonance that was positive with what you say. It's natural, because he's natural law. And it's about the truth and empirical values. And it is, like you say, it's a incomplete expression which you are now seeking to complete, which I appreciate.
Athens or Europa, Semitia. I just call it Europa and Semitia. What happens? Aristocracy, peasantry, evolution, protection, right? And these two things come together. And so if you look at it that way, then the church was mostly right. And the mix of church and state was the right answer, not what the Byzantines did. It was the balance of church and state and law That was the right answer, because that maintained the Indo-European trifunctional tradition. So you've got the martial aristocracy and the church nobility and the law, right, which is the secular part, and the law decides.
Tying your work to that work because it's related to Thomas Aquinas, of course.
I would say you can take the Aristotelian modeling and up my work. You can take the Christian version of it. It's just a preference to which priority you put first. If you take the Aquinian model, just as Augustine was trying to unify Greek reason and Christian theology, Aquinas was trying to do it. And for the same reason, in the ancient world, they were having the problem of the power of Greco-Roman reason and logic and science versus the superstition. And so what happened is after the Muslim scholars fled, they brought back all this stuff into Europe because the Christians had destroyed it all. So once that knowledge has been back, it got spread by the Italians up the trade routes. And of course, now the Christians had to deal with accommodating Arianism a second time. And this time they got even closer. Well, why? Because the law had remained constant over time. And by the time that this literature got back, commerce had started to develop. So empiricism and reason had emerged, as it always does under contract law. The fact that our law survived, even though our religion barely did, is why it was possible to combine our law, Aristotelian thought, or Greek thought, and find some accommodation with church. So what, of course, Augustine does is he says natural law, in other words, laws of nature, are God's law. And so this ends up with the scholastics and Thomism, which is basically, the universe is God. So whenever conflicts with science, science is the judge, right? Science is true. This ends up being what I argue all the time, which is you can tell us true or false, that's great, but that doesn't end up with the good, right? The good is a choice. And so I call myself a Jeffersonian because Jeffersonian completed the Thomist sort of project by reducing the Bible to only what Jesus said, thus creating him a philosopher that was within the Western tradition of philosophers, thus being the philosopher of basically the underclasses, but really philosopher of love. Love in the sense it's a necessary institution for human cooperation. And so I see the church as having failed in the 1800s to make the next transformation. And in my view, I see my work quite reluctantly and post hoc as the completion of that project of the unification of Athens and Jerusalem. Athens as the aristocracy and Jerusalem as the peasantry, what we call slave morality. That's why I say the church blew it, because they could have just said, wow, we were right all along.
Right.
It just took us a long time. It took science a long time to get here. Well, it took us a long time to get here. We took it from two different sides. We took it from the desire side, and science took it from the true side. And we ended up with the natural law. And the natural law is clearly God's law. God's law is unfortunately not kind. So it means evolve or die. And Christian love is the only way to tolerate it. This means Christianity is the only religion per se, that is not counter to the laws of nature. There's a difference between Stoicism and Christianity. Stoicism says, I will not let this world affect me, the world of others. But Christian doesn't say that. Christian says, I will love you until you submit to loving me too. You can't understand it unless you understand there are only so many things the universe has to work with. But once you see how the universe has to work with, you realize, damn it, the church could have really pulled it off there. What's the difference between my work, which is science, law, and religion? What's the difference between science, law, and religion now? Well, there isn't any. There's no difference between the natural law and Christian teaching, at least in its most modern incarnation. Because, of course, science was very primitive in the ancient world and got very sophisticated. Well, Christianity was very primitive in the ancient world, and it's become very sophisticated. The answer is we ended up unifying them both. And so we didn't fail. And this is, like I said yesterday, one of the beautiful experiments that's running right now is we're seeing Islam in North Africa and evangelical Protestantism in the sub-Saharan Africa. And there's typically been the argument that Islam is a good religion for poor people. My argument is no, it's the worst fucking possible religion for poor people because it makes them stay poor. Christianity doesn't. It doesn't persist low trust like Islam does. It doesn't persist tribalism like Islam does. It essentially prepares you for a middle-class society, which means prosperity, by treating everyone as a customer rather than the member of a cult. So you have to love people rather than oppress people. And so what's happening in Africa is we're running this beautiful test, and it's going to prove out during this century, I'm pretty sure, that Africa was the great test that Christianity is a better religion for poor people, and the Muslims are wrong. Islam isn't a reformation of Christianity, it's a heresy. We have to tell the story of the unification of Athens and Jerusalem. Because we had an old peasant slave culture and a new aristocratic culture. And the problem with the slave culture is it couldn't produce an aristocracy. And the problem with the aristocratic culture is it had no place for the peasantry. Now, you could make the argument that the Indo-Europeans should have, I don't mean this. I'm making an evolutionary observation to draw a contrast. You could make an argument the Indo-Europeans should have eradicated everybody else, like we eradicated the Amerindians. That probably is the right answer if you want to maximize evolutionary computation. But on the other hand, the more human result is to say, let's not eradicate everybody else. Let's find a solution to the class problem. Uniting Europe and Semitia means that you find a solution for the underclass and you maintain the utility of the upper class. And in doing so, you produce Arianism, which is science, in the state, and in Semitia, you produce superstition and the religion. And you get as has been off-stated, you get master-slave, or I prefer it as aristocracy, peasantry philosophy. And the two together are the solution to dragging more people forward without treating people as animal power, because that's really what they did. And we lived in a world of animal power until Britain invented the steam engine, invented and applied the steam engine. So we lived in a world of animal power. Humans were treated as an aspect of animal power. Once we got out of that bind, it was a lot easier to treat everybody better. What Christianity did is it found a way for treating animal power as if they're human rather than animals. Again, I say the story we have to tell is that unification, which is here. The story that you don't want me to tell is what the enemy did. Yeah, it's seduction and force. So the problem is religion is seduction, but seduction does work. Does a mother seduce her children by means of affection? Absolutely, positively. Does she calm their nerves by storytelling? Absolutely, positively. Does she provide them will to continue despite adversity? Absolutely, positively. Those are all forms of seduction. They're not truths, they're seductions, but they work. What's the same thing with force? We can organize people into armies. Well, that's great. But armies run out of things to loot.
Sorry, we're out. We ran out. It's like, oh, that's bad.
Eventually you have to, and hunter-gatherers run out of things to hunt. So eventually you have to result in cooperation. So you run out of things to seduce people with, and the consequences of seduction. So once you understand those are the weapons: seduction, force, and trade. The only one that identifies cooperation between the two, in other words, the only one that increases mass and energy, is trade. People that went away, while I was doing my attack on Christianity, and they're slowly coming back.
Wait. You were busy. You were working.
I do what I do it every time. I just attack everything until there's nothing left to attack. And whatever's left is the first principle.
That works.
It just works. And then once you know what the first principles are, You can go through something like Christianity, which is full of a whole lot of nonsense, and you can say, okay, this part is true.
Right. Right. It's a distillation process then.
Somebody said, can you really outlaw communism? You can not only outlaw communism, you can outlaw every single false promise there is, right? Every variation on it. The problem is that ends up outlawing every religion other than Christianity, because Christianity is the only one that's been fully
Vetted.
right?
Civilized.
That, vetted is the right one. It's civilized. That book, The Germanization of Christianity, is a great book. I grew up in a world where there was just as much Germanic fairy tales as there
Yes.
are.
Yes.
And I had more close reaction to here's your kid. I can understand the fairy tales. And that's what they were trying to do in the 1800s. You get into the Romantic period and they're trying to restore our traditional religion with a Christian bent. Because the original one,
It was rough.
it was for people constantly at war. They were trying to build classicalism with Christian affectations. And then you get to explain why the combination of Jerusalem and Athens worked. It's because Europeans figured out the primacy of man and the rapidity of evolution. The problem was it would have left the rest of the world behind as a permanent underclass, and Christianity provided the answer to the salvation of the underclasses, which is love. Love is the only way you can tolerate continuous recursive evolution and the stresses of it, because really God's laws aren't nice.
The rough world.
They aren't kind at all. God is a slave driver. He's like, either you will evolve or you will die. When the purpose of Western civilization for 5,000 years has been, I'm going to create mindfulness in you by giving you responsibility. And where we fail, Christianity is going to come in and give you responsibility, no matter if you're not able, you don't have any resources, you don't have any family, you don't have any allies, you don't have any money, and you're not strong. You can still be responsible. You can be responsible for the good. That's the secret of our thing, our magic, is that you're responsible. If you stack up all the means for obtaining mindfulness, in other words, certainty, mental calm, peace of mind, satisfaction, climbing the pyramid, it's responsibility that is the only one that isn't false. Stoicism just teaches you how to ignore what you can't be responsible for. Buddhism teaches you how to ignore not only what you can't be responsible for, but anything that would bother you. The rest of them, you go downhill to Hinduism, which Buddhism is a reformation of, and they're saying, well, just like Europeanism is a reformation of Indo-European religion. The Hindus are saying, you're responsible for this right here, and you're a good person as long as you're responsible for that. And they're responsible for that. And as long as everybody does his duty, we're a cultural army. India doesn't. Then you go down to Islam, which says you got to do all these ridiculous rituals every day. You don't have to know anything else except memorize these things and follow it. Then you go down to Christianity, which says, okay, just do these rituals and prayers, and you're only responsible for these things, and you're not responsible for others. What that means is the aristocracy and the middle class are going to be responsible for them. You don't have to be, because you're just peasants. Then you get down to magic and woo-woo and cults and pseudosciences. We're producing the mindfulness spectrum to compensate for our powerlessness in obtaining responsibility. Yet what does Western civilization do? It tries every way possible to make you responsible so that you can have mindfulness, and so everybody will treat you with respect. And what does the left do? Destroy it. Your friends are anyone who will give you loyalty to the production of common, not the commons you want, but the freedom to create commons you do want.
Like you want.
Right. And so for me, I'm loyal to fundamentalist Christians. I would enjoy living them. I don't want them to govern, but if they want to govern themselves, fine. You know what will happen when we create all these things? The good will emerge and the bad will be cast off, and then we'll reconverge, right? That's what will happen. Meanwhile, the left, once no longer able to undermine, they'll collapse, because all the bad people will go there. They'll have the bottom and the top authoritarians. They will essentially create states that function like the church for the dysfunctional. What is the social media? It's not a source of truth. It's a source of conformity to whatever advances the economic interest of the artificial state within a state we call FANG. They're producing a state within a state the way Christians produced a state within the Roman state. They're undermining us from within. And so they're creating a state within a state in the hopes that that state, which is the financial sector, the media sector, the advertising sector, the academy, and the new social media, they're forming a state within a state the way the church formed a state within a state in the Roman Empire and destroyed the Roman Empire. They're destroying us by the way they're destroyed. Now, what they destroyed the Roman Empire, they destroyed aristocracy, truth, duty, reciprocity, sovereignty, and loyalty. They destroyed that system in order to replace it with the Semitic system of clerisy. What's happening today is they're destroying our system of truth, duty, reciprocity, sovereignty, self-determination, loyalty. They're undermining that by a pseudoscientific clerisy and a sophistic clerisy. There's always, in order to get theology or pseudoscience, you have to use sophistry. You have to go through sophistry to create either one of those. So they've created this big lie. The reason you have the need for mindfulness is because you want responsibility, because responsibility is an empirical evidence of your value to the tribe. The reason you evolved that need for mindfulness. Why do you think we invented religions? Because people needed mindfulness because all of a sudden they weren't fucking valuable. That's what these things tell you. So what do religions try to do? They try to create means by which you have responsibility, even if you don't have assets. Well, what's the European religion? European religion's aristocratic. It's all about responsibility. But what does that leave for the slaves and the women and the underclasses and the immigrants? It means they're dirt, right? Because they don't have any responsibility. What did Christianity provide them? Responsibility for not doing harm. Right? Virtue in the via negativa, expressed as the via negativa as Christian love. Christianity solved the problem of the fact that, yeah, the Europeans discovered responsibility, including the responsibility of man for himself by the primacy of man and the end of dependence on nature. Europeans discovered adulthood. What does that leave everybody else? It means that, holy shit, this is hard. Christianity solved the problem of bringing into the empire. Unfortunately, as always happens, if you let the bottom classes get out of hand, they try to reverse responsibility in toto. They don't try to just understand this is our duty, is given our resources and ability to do good by doing no harm, and to do it by the one force available to us, love, instead of that force available to those who have resources, money and power, and those who have force, power and status. So it worked. It makes perfect sense. Just understand, there's no homogeneity to be made. Equality is suicide. It doesn't allow us to be able to obtain responsibility because we are unequal in our capacity for responsibility, because we're unequal in our capacity for ability. So that's the reason that the military order and the military status is so important. You get respect and status for doing your duty regardless of rank. If you're a good Christian, you're essentially an infantryman who's guarding the gates. He's not asking you to be a general or a captain or even a sergeant. They're asking you to guard the fucking gates. Don't let the little bad things happen that turn into big bad things. If you're in the middle class, don't let bad trades happen. If you're in the aristocracy, don't let bad institutions and organizations form. That's all it's about, this feminine authoritarian caretaking system, which they can exploit for their own by producing a new clerisy, a new religion. And they've done it. We've been colonized. You've been colonized by this hostile minority in the post-war period very quickly. And you won't tolerate the fact that it's because of the natural vulnerability of Christianity, given Christian faith, and its over-tolerance and over-pacifism, and its emphasis on the good instead of the emphasis on the bad and false. In other words, Christian faith as a way of foregoing responsibility for policing the commons against false promises, because to some degree Christianity sounds like a false promise that you can escape scarcity and the laws of nature by the use of love of one another, when it just means you can escape how bad it feels to be under God's tragic, unpleasant laws if you use Christian love over one another. Once we killed the monarchies, people blame it on the failure of the church. That's not true. The church morality persists. What failed is once we lost the monarchies, we lost Arianism, we lost hierarchy, we lost heroism, we lost the path to responsibility as demonstrated responsibility for family, industry, polity, and war. And so we've been recolonized by a new faith, another Jewish faith, just like Christianity was a Jewish faith. We've been recolonized the same way the Jewish Christians colonized the old world, by going through women and using women and then the immigrants and slaves of the old world, or immigrants and ex-slaves in this world. They've rallied these people that it's not the universe that creates scarcity, regression to the mean, human immorality, but it is the white people that do so in this world, just like it was the Romans in the ancient world. Obviously, when I come along and I try to teach you these sciences, you interpret them as what you can. You're going to interpret them through the lens that you know, which is the lens of the good, which is do good, the language of women and children, instead of the language of adults and men, which is, yes, the way we limit the good to that which is actually good is by policing it, by preventing the false and the bad. So when I try to teach you the sciences, you interpret them as theology, philosophy, or norms, or traditional morality, when these things all try to teach you the good. When I say something's good, I say, well, it conforms to the laws of the universe, therefore it doesn't violate them. There is an optimum form of government because it enforces those laws. There's an optimum structure of law because there's a way to enforce those laws. But those are, for all intents and purposes, the universe's laws or God's laws. Whatever, they're the same thing before we get married. Because if we get married under these conditions, we're screwed if it breaks. It's the reason we need the church to be like a financial advisor, a legal advisor, a behavioral therapist, right? You need those things in the church if you want a church today. People don't need woo-hoo. They need something that's materially gainful. That's what I think a church should look like. The problem is the kind of people who are attracted to church service, or the people who are attracted to education, are those least valuable in communicating it. Whereas these people used to come from the aristocracy, they're now coming from the lower middle class. They're not people who are educated. They're not even people with good behaviors. Matter of fact, the reason they go into the church, the academy, or the state government is to escape the market, which is the whole purpose of those three institutions, is to train you for it. Now we have to change the incentives, change who we allow into government, academy, and church. You can't fix it now. Once the Byzantines created the Council of Nicaea and mixed law with religion, they deterministically produced Islam. And then what happened? We lost all the great civilizations of the ancient world. Islam thinks they're a reformation of Christianity. They're a heresy of Christianity. But what's Nicaea and the formalization of Christianity? It's a heresy against Christianity. So what's Judaism? It's a heresy against religion. I read something by somebody echoing my opinion about Hinduism as a sort of ultimate religion, because it's not, if you're going to have a religion, that's the one. Because fundamentally, if you can find something to imitate in there that's virtuous, no matter who you are, right? It doesn't ask you all to be the same. The last guy is Peterson. I think he's going to fail, but he's very close. There's Peterson here and Stoicism here, and we need to make that happen. There's Peterson here, Stoicism here, and Westernism on top. We can make that triangle happen. I don't think Peterson can do it. I think his health got too broken. We'll see. And I think he might be too distracted by all of this to do it. The natural outcome of Peterson is what should have happened by the unification of Christianity and Stoicism. If the occultist hadn't won, we would have had what Peterson is saying, which is a very Christian and forgiving version of Stoicism. It's a combination of Stoic self-discipline and self-authoring with this Christian love. And I think he would have gotten there. And I think to understand him in that frame is good. Like I said, I would expect my work to go to religion next, because I actually want to solve that problem, because it looks really obvious to me what a good religion would look like going forward that didn't burn Christianity. It wouldn't burn it would fix the problem, because secular humanism is just, it's going to end up in communism. But his fundamental insight was simply that it's like the fundamental insight of Christianity. The fundamental insight of the Greeks is tragedy. And the fundamental insight of the Indo-Europeans is the primacy of man over nature. The Greeks, the tragedy is a derivation of the primacy of man. Roman law and administration is just Indo-European paternalism. Christianity, however, is the thing that the Middle East provided, because aristocrat people treat common folk as domesticated animals. What Christianity did is it allowed those people to join in. You can see this whole correction of the combination of Christianity, Arianism, and paganism, martial paganism. You can see that sitting out there, and the container that makes it ritualized is Stoicism. I say that, my friend says, well, it's more Epicureanism. Like, well, this Epicurean philosophy is right, but the Stoic method of self-discipline is right. So the Stoics were wrong about a lot of things, but they got the method right. The Epicureans were right about a lot of things, but they didn't produce a method. The difference with Stoicism is it produced a ritual. We don't think of it that way. And what do you think frickin' Peterson's self-authoring kit? It's just how to teach yourself the ritual of continuous self-improvement. It's just ritualizing the process. Well, if we taught everybody to ritualize the process, and frankly, they did this in the 1800s. By the 1800s, if you kept a diary, that's what you were doing. The purpose of a diary isn't just memories. It's Stoic self-record and self-improvement. That's the reason you keep a diary. And the reason you want to teach somebody to keep a diary is to develop the habit of self-reflection and self-improvement. And the virtues, which were started by the Stoics and adopted by the Christians, is just which virtues am I trying to improve in myself? If you teach people that discipline, you've got religion. Now, that's why Buddhism is got a lot of legs, because if it becomes westernized right enough, it starts to go here. But the better one is one without woo at all, which is Stoicism. There's no woo in it at all. It's purely cognitive behavioral therapy, science. Does that mean we give up Christianity? No, you give up. You can even keep the supernaturalism if you have this other stuff. But Aristotelianism is universal truth. Pagan is nationalist heroism. And Christianity is familial and social love. That's the triangle of three forces, right? I mean, it's always there. And Stoicism is just a ritual, the ritual of self-authoring. We can do that at every scale. All of this is possible without producing what happens in most structured religions, is continuous prohibition on the development of new knowledge and continuous adaptation. They tend to be anchoring. And that's why I had hope for Peterson before he got sick. Now, when I listen to him, he's not all there. What's the guy that said that you have to choose? It's just wiser to choose that there might be a God. Who said that? 20 people will leave it in the comments. Basically, given that we don't know, probably can't know, given that it's a low-cost thing to do, it's better to behave as if it's true. And this is especially true since some of us can't believe and some of us need to. So the loyalty response to one another is to demonstrate the low-cost loyalty to those who need, simply because it turns out that the Stoics had it. And unfortunately, I understand that the Stoics were for people like us, educate. And then Christianity was for the little people. So Christianity used a lot of the same techniques. Prayer is so Peterson, the reason I was hopeful for Peterson and he's going to fail was that he would continue his work, which would logically end up with a reformation of Stoicism, the unification of Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Christianity. If he hadn't gotten sick, hadn't gotten popular, maybe his work would have led him to complete the project. But if you say to something, I pray, praying works. Now, we know scientifically why it works. In other words, even if there isn't a God, it works. So the same thing says, what is Stoicism? Stoicism is just doing it with yourself, somewhat like Buddha. So it's like Christianity, Buddhism, Stoicism, but they're all doing the same thing, which is attempting for you to use intentional rehearsal, because rehearsal is to self-discipline yourself, to train yourself, rather than being trained by others. And this matters because we're no longer in bands and small tribes where we're being sufficiently trained by others within a causal arc of everything that we actually interact with. But once we get civilizations of larger scale, it isn't clear any longer that we can obtain the sufficient information to self-moderate. So prayer or Buddhist contemplation or Stoic self-authoring, it's the same damn thing. It's just, Christianity takes the more feminine, submissive road. Buddhism takes the more neutral road, and Stoicism takes the more responsible road. I'm responsible. God's responsible, or completely, and I'm only responsible for this, Buddhism. So it actually works, and you realize that this is fulfilling the problem of mindfulness, and these narratives of self-training became necessary as we were naturally atomized from one another in the division of labor with scale. So we made this terrible trade-off, which you see everywhere around us today, is every time we get richer, we get more alienated, and we have greater need for self-regulation. So my argument was, and still is, that you have to train the body, fitness, you have to train the intuition, mindfulness, you have to train the intellect, general rules, and then you have to provide skills that are economically viable. This doesn't matter, economically viable, unless you have physical training, intuitionistic training, and mindfulness, and general rules that allow you to just get together with people. And that's the investment necessary to make people happy. So what do? We teach them this bullshit propaganda. We don't prepare them for the workplace. We don't make them fit, and we don't teach them mindfulness under the illusion that everybody's just going to naturally float. We're going to naturally float because we're all special. No, we're freaking animals with the random number generators creating variation between us, and we need to be trained in those things necessary to not only succeed in, but just to fucking tolerate the division of labor. Just to tolerate it. It's like the same thing is like we discover the laws of nature are tragic. The Greeks were right. The tragedy is the optimum religion, not Christianity. The tragedy, Christianity is just how we tolerate it. And even Christianity versus Buddhism versus Stoicism, those are just the masculine, neutral, and feminine methods of justifying training. So you have the slave morality of the feminine, which is this is an authority imposing it upon you, and you're trying to submit to it, which it invokes the pack response. It works. And you have the masculine responsible one, Stoicism, which invokes the adult responsibility, paternal response, heroic response. And this is a normal distribution of behavior across the human bot spectrum, because the primary axis of our differences, which are necessary for evolutionary computation, is sex differences in the division of time. So of course you would get short-term emotional Christianity for the feminine and long-term, in other words, submissive feminine and responsible Stoicism. You would get those two things. Humanity would naturally produce them, because there's demand in a feminine, submissive underclass and a competitive, adversarial, aristocratic upper class. You would get those things come out because they're expressions of tolerance for the group evolutionary strategy, given the agency, resources, and cooperation available for your group. My wife was an amazing Stoic. Every night, she would just sit up in bed like this, and she would replay her day. And when she'd get up in the morning, she would plan her day. And that's how she self-modified. But you have to have a certain amount of rather high level of executive function to behave that way on your own. But if you're neurotic, you have low conscientiousness, you need the church. You need social inclusion. You need those things. Even in Buddhism, they call a monk. Being a Buddhist monk isn't like being a monk. It's more like going to college. You're going there to learn the discipline of self-discipline, right? So you can self-regulate. And what's the difference? You get an aggressive expansionist society under the Stoic Western method. You get a stagnating society under the Buddhist method, and you get a regressive society under the Semitic method. And of course, because those are the things, your computational velocity is determined by how much will you exert on self-modification and adaptation.
You use the term training, and I would use the term culture.
Well, what's the difference?
Well, there's a
Culture is environmental saturation.
Right.
Training is someone else giving it to you by design, and discipline is you doing it to yourself.
There you go. But it's the issue is this in the context of our conversations pertaining to civilizational activity, it turns into culture.
No, you're right. These means have to work commensurably. In other words, you can't commingle Islam and Christianity. You can't commingle Chinese authoritarian state worship and secular humanism. They don't commingle. And so if you practice different religions, so to speak, which is different means of self-authoring, you're putting the responsibility for self-authoring in yourself, in your family, in the people you associate with, in your church, in your society, in your government. But that's what's really happening with this priority, is you're giving the responsibility of self-authoring either centrally, like in China, or you're doing it distributedly, like in Stoicism. But the problem you have is that because you're originating the causal axis of self-regulation in some of those spheres, they're not compatible. So that's why I say religions aren't compatible. There can be no freedom of religion because they produce different demands for different group evolutionary strategies, and they do in fact produce differences in group evolutionary strategies. Religion is a means of warfare against those with different organizing principles than you. There cannot be freedom of religion. Can there be freedom of Christian religion? Absolutely. Can there be freedom of Islamic religion? Can there be freedom of Buddhist religion? Can there be freedom of secular humanist religion? Sure. But they produce different demands for self, for social, for educational, they produce a different group or evolutionary strategy.
I would describe
This
that.
is why I said, if you want to come to the West, you've got to be Aristotelian, scientific, pagan, historical heroes, which are adversarial competition, and Christian love, which is you are endlessly forgiving to those people that you can afford to be endlessly forgiving to. If you can't do that, you can't come here because you're basically conducting war against our institutional cultural production. And people attribute that as religion is some arbitrary, meaningless, distant thing. It's not. It's just the means of producing mindfulness, and the means by which you produce mindfulness determine the structure of the rest of the society, which means that there are no commensurable world religions, because the world religions are all reflections of the civilizations, which are reflections of the demographics and territory, which are reflections of their history, which are reflections of the group competitors and the means by which people organize. And we don't want to homogenize them because, of course, what that does is it limits evolutionary computation to putting all your eggs in one basket.
Such admixtures generate necessary cultural dissonance.
Yeah, they insert disorder into a system of order, increasing the cost on everyone from the psychological to the social to the economic to the political to the strategic. Every single person you bring in who doesn't fully integrate is a much higher cost than all the economic costs. In other words, material cost is absolutely trivial compared to the civilizational cost, cultural cost, political and social costs. If you want to find the inflection point of what went wrong, it's when the Supreme Court didn't hold up the argument, in other words, shot down the argument that communism was a religion. In other words, McCarthy was right. He was not zealous enough, and it was a new religion. As a religion, you would take all this stuff, this Marxism, PC woke, out of the academy that's financed by the government and prohibit it from the school system because it's religion. The difference is there was no reformer like me in the 1800s, so there was no one to demarcate religion as a false promise of freedom from the universe by the three means of fictionalism available to man: occult to supernaturalism, theology; sophistry to idealism, philosophy; and magic to pseudoscience. These are all the three things that are available: the physical, the emotional, and the verbal. These are the only three means of overloading the human mind with falsehood by false promise. So it was completely possible for the Supreme Court to rule that this was an invasive religion that wasn't constructive. Whereas if I go to Christianity, I'm like, yeah, well, it's a fictionalism, but it's not false, because it's actually the scientific answer to the problem of cooperation at scale. There was no time at which I could put a brief before the Supreme Court, right, that could say, actually, communism's a religion. It's a religion of war. Moreover, freedom of religion has to be limited to those religions that don't war against the foundations of our civilization and the foundations of our law. Islam shouldn't be legal in the West because it's an act of war. I mean, Judaism is an act of war. The thing about Buddhism is they bring Buddhism in and they automatically turn it into secular humanism with it's hysterical that Buddhism just got turned into white folk secular humanism with meditation. It's fucking hysterical when meditation is just rehearsal, right? It's just prayer, except that you're taking your own responsibility for it. This is another example of our law was insufficient to defend ourselves from warfare by other means. And we don't even recognize it as warfare because we spent so many thousands of years ritualizing and domesticating war that we can't imagine that, China's beating us because they practice total war and they're at war against us. And we call it a cold war. It's not cold. It's just not physical. It's a hot war. It's just not physical, right? And the physical thing is what happens when you've exhausted the means of winning by non-physical means. We just have all these Christian, they're actually Greek, right? This Greek utopian, Christian utopian, enlightenment utopian bullshit. We believe our own bullshit. Upward redistribution of unearned income as unearned income. So, the problem is Christian. I keep going back to this. Universalism, that we have to be the same, that we have to be equal. Instead of we need multiple economies in any economy. You take care of the people at the bottom because, frankly, they need taken care of, and because you're paying them not to undermine. It's the same thing as Christianity. You don't have to be rich or powerful or strong or mighty or talented. You just have to not do bad. And you don't even have to do good. You just have to not do bad. What we see today is PC woke. It's really just war against institutions, culture, and production by offering false promises of freedom from the laws of nature by the end of whiteness. And they said it was a universal ambition rather than just one to destroy the West and to create themselves as an authoritarian cult over the West that was perpetually extractive, like the church had tried to be perpetually extractive, like our current financial sector is perpetually extractive. The perpetually extractive financial sector uses it to bribe and pay off the deep state to keep getting larger and larger and larger to bring about this destruction of the West through the promise of universalism, that they can bring about this wonderful thing in the universe, which of the whole world, which of course would destroy evolutionary computation. The way that Islam destroyed evolutionary computation went back, Judaism eliminated evolutionary computation. So despite being the most literate people in history, they went through more than 1,000 years and contributed absolutely nothing. Christianity came along and created a dark age, which produced almost nothing, except that some people could couch their science in Christian terms and get away with it. And we finally escaped it, and now they're coming back with it in another attempt to produce feminine monopoly authoritarianism by the generation of demand for attention, by the false promise of freedom from the laws of universe, which undermine the necessity of continuous recursive evolutionary computation, which is the reason we're wealthy and prosperous in the first place, and we haven't declined like the Middle East or gone stagnant like India or slowed to near stagnancy like China. So these people are the enemy of life. Now, it's not just the Europe. They're the enemy of life. We never got to the point where I am, where we could say to the Supreme Court, actually, communism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, PC, anti-male feminism, PC woke, these are frauds. They're not philosophies, They're frauds. They're religions that make a false promise of freedom to the universe after they destroy our civilization, when it is our civilization and its first principles embodied in our law of natural law, Christian love, that made possible the elimination and eradication of the negative, making us free to maximize the search for the positive. We can outlaw all these things under our traditional common law. There is no right to any religion. There's a right to any religion that doesn't violate our group evolutionary strategy as expressed scientifically in our law. In fact, any hostile religion is just a means of warfare. Any pseudoscientific religion like PC woke is a means of warfare. This is war just as surely as China's using spies to steal our stuff as war, just as much as any other economic war like the attempt to manipulate oil prices for the world or physical invasion or immigration. These are all methods of war. They're all methods of imposing costs on people against their will in order to generate demand for authority, generates demand for attention, where that attention is obtained by false promise of freedom from whiteness, where whiteness is just science.
Got this, the people want to know, what religion are you, Curt?
This came out, somebody said this to a bunch of us, and of course it's baiting me into hazard, right? Or they're trying to bait me into something. I'm like, and so I'm just going to reverse it on them and say I'm a universal scientific truth, meaning I'm an Aristotelian, which is even though it's probably more Epicurean or Democritusian, but we use the term Aristotelian for this space. So I'm a universal Aristotelian, which is truth, a pagan, which in the sense that it's a nationalist martial heroism, right? It's hero worship. And I'm a Christian in the sense that it requires civic interpersonal love, the exhaustion of the opportunity for love. And I don't see a conflict between those things. And my problem is that the minute you say you're going to monopolize one of them, you're abandoning one of those other two axes. And in a sense, then anything other than what I just said means that you're pursuing a monopoly in order to escape the costs of preserving your society. So I'm an anti-monopolist because it violates our trifunctionalism. That's what it means. It means you're violating the trifunctionalism of European civilization. So you're anti-civilization. If you try to create a monopoly, and the people I'm generally addressing are the fundamentalists who deny science and deny martial responsibility, or one or both, and triple down on fundamentalism. They're just tax evaders for the normative commons, the institutional commons. That was my pushback against somebody baiting me into what religion. I'm an Aristotelian, I'm a pagan, I'm a Christian. That's what it means to be European. Because it means trifunctionalism. If you're not all three of those, you're something else. But it certainly isn't European. It's horrible. It's certainly on the scale of the Muslim conquest. Really, people don't realize this, but Islam has killed more people than anything except the Great Plagues. Communism, which is the worst thing that's ever happened in our recent memory, has no comparison to the deaths under Islam. There's no comparison. And Islam is only second to, what did malaria and smallpox do? I mean, we lost Egypt, North Africa, every civilization of the Levant, Mesopotamia, Persia, Anatolia, Northwest India, Byzantium, and Southeastern Europe. And we don't even know if we can get Southeastern Europe back, and it looks like we can't get Persia back. And it looks like, Northwest India, instead of being the home of Indian civilization, which could have reached its great flowering, is going to be a failed state over and over and over until something catastrophic happens, which means they have to be conquered. And you come back to, God damn, Christianity's good. I mean, you really get there. But the more I work on the problem, the more I understand I'm right. There just wasn't, in the 1850s, there wasn't a me, because we failed in the 1830s, because the Industrial Revolution just came too fast. There was nobody to go to the church from within the church to say, well, we've been right all along. It's, Jesus is teaching us to love, to tolerate what the Greeks had discovered, and we're trying to put this together into a narrative. That narrative turns out to be natural law and Christian love. And sorry, that's science. And so the church can claim it's spent 2,000 years trying to merge science and theology in a unified system. And we, the Catholic Church, were the ones who did it. That could have happened. They could have started telling the story in the terms of the church's historical success at the unification of the suffering of the peasantry under Semitism and the discoveries and the prosperity of the Europeans under aristocracy. And the two could have come together as the church, as the great unifier. It's so easy for the church to claim victory, but the problem with any bureaucracy is it becomes anchored. And unless you get a reformer that's promising freebies, you get doubling down. And so I'm like, dude, here's all the freebies for the church. Just claim victory over mankind. And it's science. The unification of Athens and Jerusalem, or Rome, Athens and Jerusalem, Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. The unification was achieved by the church despite the great difference between Semitic supernatural authoritarianism and European aristocratic meritocracy. And the only way to make this work is that the secular application of laws of reciprocity and the markets that produce them and the Christian love of one another instituted by the church in order to have us make the truth of God's laws, which are tragic, tolerable. And that's what makes human life beautiful, is our love of each other despite the tragedy of God's laws. It's a beautiful story, and nobody did it. It's really, they've got it backwards. As Europeans discovered God's law, but Jesus gave us man's wisdom. Which is, it's the only way to get through it is love. And since the only way to get through it is love, that's part of God's law too. I'm just complaining because you're, as you say, it's just much easier to talk to Catholic men. I can't talk to fundamentalist men because they're crazy.
So
they go off in this theological nonsense, and it's not like the church, which found the middle ground, found the compromise ground. The church that taught dogma didn't even teach the Bible. The Protestants brought the Bible back, and they were so close. You can see in the scholastics, they were so goddamn close. And then you get into the Brits who bring in Protestantism, but they really don't. They just maintain the Catholic Church as a nationalist rather than globalist institution, the British. And you come back to the Catholic intellectuals, which of course we see in my hero Scalia, are right. Or you see it in Judge Thomas. They're right. Sorry. They just couldn't. It's like the guy who gets to the finish line and he relaxes. And, he relaxes because he doesn't realize how close the competitors are behind him. And he slows down and they pass him just as they cross the finish line, and he loses the race. And that's what happened to the church. And so now it's turning into a, third world religion that is basically globalist and communist, which is its natural disposition when it's not owned by the aristocracy, which is what really happened in Europe. The church tried to take over and it failed, and it got owned by the aristocracy as the extended family of the aristocracy. And so it produced the equilibrium between the martial empirical aristocracy and the peasantry who were governed by the church. And we just managed that difference through a hierarchy of courts. And it worked perfectly because the hierarchy of courts move in radius of the effect of our interactions. We do the wrong fucking thing every time because of this, what I call it, the Christian lie, the Christian universal lie of equality, because agrarianism failed in 800. And if we hadn't had Christianity on one hand and the Germanic barbarians on the other, in other words, if Rome hadn't overextended, then maybe Rome would have invented the Industrial Revolution because it was right there sitting on their doorstep. They had all the parts. And then we wouldn't have had the Dark Ages. We wouldn't have had the Muslim conquest and the Muslim destruction of the ancient world. We might have saved mankind, but people don't get. These civilizations are trying for this thing called equality instead of evolution. In other words, equality here rather than relative equality as we move forward. They're just destroying evolutionary computation. They're dooming us to what happened in 800 behavior, but it's just antisocial behavior. So you want to know why the Muslims do what they do? It's that they're hyper-regulating female social behavior. antisocial behavior. And that's because it's more common in the demographic distribution of an 84-centric IQ that have to regulate it, hyper-regulate it. So, I mean, of course they're going to produce Islam. They have to. Of course we're going to produce Christianity. We have to. Of course the upper middle class and the upper class are going to produce secular humanism because that's all we need to. The problem is they're destroying our civilization with a bunch of false lies defended with economic pseudoscience, which is just a new religion. And woke is the religious expression of the pseudoscientific religion that they have brought into being by this century and a half of sophistry, pseudoscience, and deceit, and wishful thinking, and other stupid shit that was completely unnecessary.
I regard it as a counter-revolution.
Yes.
Okay,
So
so
it's a counter-revolution, but it's a continuation of the counter-revolution that began with converting from morality. Our morality was a reduction of empirical evidence over thousands of years that was gradually evolved to a theoretical and bureaucratic and semi-professional and credentialed mysticism based on pseudoscience and sophistry and false promise. That's why I tie it together. There's no difference between monotheistic religions and today. I mean, they made up shit in the past and our guys made up shit in the present. It's the same lie underneath it, but the difference is that they were promising stuff after death and we're promising stuff after white men. But there's no difference. It's the same shit, same stupid lie that you can defeat the forces of nature, that there will be plenty, that you will live forever, that our conflicts will be gone. No, the only way conflicts are gone are the things that the ancient world and the PC woke world are rebelling against, which is the Indo-Europeans are the first people to break with the victimization of nature and turn it to the primacy of man by the applied use of technology and a social order of equality. We discovered rapid human calculation, cooperation at scale, and they didn't because they developed familial parasitism. In retrospect, it's all the same thing. And we keep tearing up civilizations and causing dark ages and millennia of suffering and wars because the truth is too difficult to imagine, yet the Greeks discovered it. A tragedy, and it's a fucking tragedy because evolution is tragic. The world isn't built for us. The gods are specious. And Jesus came along and said, look, yeah, the Indo-Europeans are right. It's a tragedy. Gods are specious. But the only way to get through it is to love each other. So we turned that into a Germanicized that religion into what turned out to be the perfect means of turning the society into pre-commercial. And so we developed commercial civilization and the science, reality, economics on one, technology out of one, and out of Christianity, we developed the precursors to commercial civilization, which let the majority of the middle class form, which allowed us to produce the extraordinary wealth with the technology, science, reason, and truth and law that developed by the Aryans, or the Aryan side. Christianity was a good thing. It made people feel good. The problem is, so does heroin. If they'd have brought Christianity in, like I said, like Jefferson said, it would have filled the hole in Western civilization that was made by the economic productivity of Western civilization that made it possible for people who were previously slaves to be independent actors, and despite their lack of resources, to be virtuous members of the society. It made it possible to convert from a slave society to a civil society because it gave an instruction set to ordinary people to work at their level. It was great, but then they brought it in and they destroyed the information system by making all this supernatural nonsense replace Greek wisdom and Roman institutions. And the aristocracy that was the parental force that made sure that those institutions stayed in place. We're doing the same thing. We've brought in enemies, enemy thinkers who sell false promises of freedom from the laws of nature, which is a discount that everybody wants to have and are willing to believe in. And they sell it to suckers first. And I'm sorry if that means women and immigrants, but that's who the suckers primarily are, or immigrants and the underclass, just like they sold it to women and slaves and immigrants in the Roman world, the disenfranchised people who couldn't compete. Yet the same thing had happened in the Roman world that happened here. But they did the same thing here, as they promised these people freedom from whiteness, the way they promised the ancient world freedom from Roman Roman paternalism, and the answer is that whiteness is just science. Roman paternalism was just science, and the science means that we followed the laws of nature, not this made-up supernatural nonsense that you guys have been practicing for 8,000 years by then. We've just repeated it. It's really easy. You destroy the information system, which is what Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, feminism, PC woke, anti-Western, anti-white male. Just that sequence is just the same evolutionary sequence as Judaism, Christianity, Islam. It's just the means by which they conduct war against our institutions of cultural production. And we learned apparently nothing from the Roman destruction of the ancient world by the Jewish Christians. And we have instead allowed a repeat of the same problem, the way the Russians had allowed the repeat of the same problem, which is why you must maintain zero tolerance for false promises of freedom from the laws of the universe, so that people can't destroy your civilization from within with promising women and simple folk freedom from the laws of nature, when in fact all they can do is reduce everyone to ignorance, superstition, and poverty, which is what results from Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, PC woke, anti-Western, anti-white, anti-male. Where that's why every other civilization stagnated and failed by 800. You could say the Chinese lasted to 1400. Yeah, well, that's great, but they lasted to 1400 because they were far enough away from the Middle East to not have a dark age like we did. They weren't infected by the monotheism. They're still atheistic. And the Japanese are still, thank God for the Japanese, still only practice the only one true religion, which is ancestor worship. It's the parable of 17 lies. Once you get a source of ignorance in there, you might as well have a lie. And those lies make you feel good, or may make life easier, or make understanding easier, but they're still falsehoods that create sources of ignorance that expand. And look what Islam did by deciding, taking it back to no, the Quran was the word of God precisely, and that God was perfect, and it was all his responsibility. We aren't responsible. We just need to follow the will of God. Well, I mean, that's poison. That's the opposite of the Red Queen. That's saying, let the Red Queen defeat us, which is what happened, right? They can't reform because there's so much falsehood in Islam. It was originally supposed to be the Jews produced a wisdom literature, the Christians produced another wisdom literature, and the Muslims produced another literature. And these three books were wisdom literatures, just like Confucius and Lao Tzu and etc. And so they were wisdom literatures. But the minute you try to turn them into law, they're not wisdom anymore, they're prisons, which is what the Byzantines did. They turned Christianity into a prison. Whereas if they were just wisdom literatures that were theological versions or authoritarian versions of philosophy, and then we wouldn't have had to have Augustine come along and turn it from authoritarian literature into natural law. He tried to combine the two, and of course, that's what created the Catholic Church's ability to keep peasants in ignorance, whereas the Romans would have just taught you philosophy, mathematics, and literacy. And we ended up with the Dark Ages, from which a third of our population still can't escape. I try to resist any appeal to wisdom literature, but once you know the science, the underlying causality, it's hard to not see the wisdom in a lot of wisdom literature.
Even if you try.
There's a lot of wisdom in wisdom literature. I wish I could get across one point to people, is that wisdom literature tends to be true. You just can't deduce from it. You can apply it, but you can't deduce anything from it. It's a very loose general rule of almost universal application, right, to any circumstance. But that means that it loses your ability to make deductions from it. That's my big problem with theology as argument rather than theology as wisdom. And in fact, I'd rather people use the Chinese method, which is not to make it into arguments, than the Abrahamic method, which is to make it into arguments. I can't remember what general says this, but it's, in the absence of information, fall back on wisdom literature. And the worst that will happen is no one will blame you. It's like you're an anti-Semite. No, I'm not. I'm anti-Abrahamic, right? Even if I'm anti-Abrahamic, I'm just anti-lying, right? It doesn't mean I'm anti-wisdom literature. I'm anti-using wisdom literature for the purpose of deduction, for the purpose of pretending coercion, so the purpose of stating your negotiating position, which is what you'd prefer in an exchange, as a truth that obviates your need for exchange so that you can oppress other people into giving you what you want against their wishes. How we make the fact that whether there's a God or not, the laws of the universe are quite unpleasant, which the Greeks understood as tragedy. What the Christians understood was these Indo-Europeans have discovered the universe is tragic, and we have to find a way of getting through this, which is Christian love. And so once you understand that that's what's going on there, we're evolving, prosperity is a measure of how we evolve. The common law of reciprocity is, and sovereignty and reciprocity is what maximizes our evolution. But all these things are only tolerable with acknowledgement of the tragedy and Christian love for one another, and therefore the insurance of one another from via negativas of evolution, just as we insure each other in our sovereignty and reciprocity as the via positiva, means of achieving it. So you have to understand that package. That's the Western package. But people come in and they hear me say something. Or they come in here, they say something like, well, the Abrahamic method, oh, you're against Christianity. No, I'm against misuse of it. I said the Jews are responsible for bringing the Semitic method of warfare into Europe. Well, it's true, but it doesn't mean we have to do anything except outlaw that method of warfare. This is the Christian problem, is conservatives are hopeful Christians, and the whole point is to make them lose all hope so that they actually show up and do something. Or are we guilty for not suppressing in other words, for our utopian Christian and French Enlightenment, both of which were feminine, right? In other words, the French are a feminine culture, and those are feminine fantasies, false promises, and the Jewish feminine false promise, both of those things we've allowed to preserve us. Christianity is a feminine religion. You can claim up patriarchy all you want, but fundamentally it's submissive, irresponsible, and says all you have to do is love. I mean, that's what it means. So you can say, well, we mix the aristocracy, our law, and Christianity into one, and that's the value system that's still present in the South. And well, I'll agree with you, but Christianity on itself is basically Judaism, which is just basically communism, which is basically a feminine religion. So you have to have all parts of the triad: the law, the natural law of the European people, the martial military aristocracy, and the feminine church, as well as the public and the peasantry in the middle. And you have to be surrounding that peasantry with all three forces so that the average people are acting what they think of as Christianity, but is really just European trifunctionalism, with the Christians thinking it's all Christianity, the fascists thinking it's all militarism, and the people like me thinking it's all law. Well, no, law is just a means by which we equilibrate the male and female distributions, because it's the only thing that which we have provides a common set of decidability and incentives, because that's what produces a middle class that has a ruling majority that satisfies the interests of all three dimensions of it. So no, we have this problem and we simply didn't defend against it. Why? Because you saw aristocracy say, well, fuck, the underclass is going to turn against us under Marxism. Fuck them. That's what happened. And so that's why you're all left behind. Well, that left the libertarians and their rule of law, tiny fraction, completely thrust out, overwhelmed. And you find the Christians sitting over here thinking, rah, rah, it's all Jesus. No, it isn't. Jesus is just 1/3 of the problem. And it only works if it's in competition with the martial aristocracy and the natural law that forces a middle-class majority civilization, which is what you sort of think of as Christian culture. But it's really not. Christianity is just the religion that was maximizing the female expression, just like the military was maximizing the male expression, just like the common natural law was maximizing the neutral expression that forced a cooperation between those people of extraordinary technical, scientific, and intellectual ability, those people with emotional and feminine strategies, and those people with masculine and force strategies. And that's really just it. I'm just trying to get around to the fact that what we're going through is a normal thing, but are you being men? Are we being men? Is being Christian being a man? Or is Christian being feminine, waiting for men to do something? Is being a fascist being a European? No. Is being a Christian being a European? No. Is being a rule of law being European? Yes. Of course, we're going there. We are all going to be under the female method of warfare. So we're going to experience what we did under Christianity, which is the destruction of most innovation, particularly innovation that is non-trivial. And so that's what's happening when you see our discourse. There's a demand for a dumber world, which we call PC woke, which denies the laws of the universe. It's a religion. It's a secular pseudoscientific religion that expressly denies the differences in man, especially scarcity, but it also denies the differences in sexes, groups, classes, and it lauds the defective. We should be able to take care of the people who are different. Oh, they're defective, but yeah, we should be able to take care of them. But you don't like lionize them as an example, but we created a victim cult, right? And so that's what they did. That's what the Abrahamic, that's what the female method does. It tells you about the victims. The women are always talking about the victims, because that's their universe. That's how they see it, because empathy would drive you. Empathy versus systematizing would drive you to a bias in those decisions. And we only succeeded because despite being invaded by the Abrahamic method, right, the Abrahamists, we were able to overcome it again. Because while people keep talking about religion as if that's what guides them, it doesn't. It guides their fantasies. What guides them is their law, because that's what's concrete. So that's why I say it's so important we go back. It's one of the most important insights is the reason the Muslims came up with Islamic law is because the Byzantines conflated church religion and Roman law, just like they conflated philosophy and religion. And what they did together by trying to create that monopoly, of course, broke the Christian tradition in the Arab world or the Middle East, who would have been fine with the 3 books of wisdom as long as they could keep their local laws. Local religion is wisdom, but local laws are life. That's what Europe got right. We got law first. So we couldn't get it wrong like the Middle East. So the problem with Byzantium is the way they solved it was trying to be cheap, and religion is cheap. Once you've got religion, now you can add law to it. Now you can rule, you can mix your rule, right? You've basically told all these people who are priests who are basically sucking the life out of peasants. I did that.
Didn't work. That one failed.
That one failed. There's priests or scam artists who are managing all these peasants that they can impose the law to. So you've used a wisdom distribution network where that wisdom literally existed for the simple purpose of letting a lot of tribal people cooperate with each other. And now you've brought in law that said, I'm going to fuck that up. Because I can make us all cooperate with each other, but I can't make us all operate the same. Right? That's a very different thing. Christianity said, create a market by love, right? And create tolerance. But it didn't say, by the way, you got to change all these freaking property rights and internal mechanisms too. Well, of course, the Arabs said, we can't fucking do that. Because they were all down there in Saudi Arabia, right? The Jews, the Christians, and the Arabs and with their stuff. And the Arabs were the ones who were behind. They decided to get ahead the way the Chinese and the Russians decided to get ahead. Because their ideas couldn't win, so they won by conquest and imposed their ideas. Because that's what people who are behind do. That's why China's a danger. This method of falsification by King of the Hill games, prosecution using King of the Hill games. This gives people the idea that I'm advocating for something rather than I'm falsifying something. I'm going to end up saying, well, we just need to fix the Catholic Church. So how do I get there? I destroy every fallacy that exists in religion. And I build religion from first principles upward. And I say, fuck, turns out the church didn't do too bad a job. They just failed to reform in the 1800s. And they failed to reform in the 1800s because of these factors. And so it's not really their fault. Do you think my business partner is Jewish? You think I'm anti-Semitic? No, I'm anti-Abrahamic. It's the same thing. It's like, are you an atheist? No. I just want to get the lies out of religion. So when I say I want to take the lies out of religion, that's different from taking the fictionalisms out. I love people who say, you quote this biblical thing because you use it as wisdom literature, but you don't say if, then, therefore. There's a difference between religion and scripture and theology. I love religion, and I think it's, I mean, I read Buddha when,
Right.
I don't know, I was in 12th grade or something, which really moved me. And then I read Siddhartha,
Yeah.
right? The books, which is, I found spiritually fulfilling. Not that, you got to understand how hard that is because how little spiritualness I have was, but I found it fulfilling. In other words, I understood him, right? And I found that beautiful and heroic. So when I say that, I mean, you don't use wisdom as if it's logic. You don't use philosophy as if it's science. So when people argue with me that it's true metaphysically, it's not true rationally or scientifically. So it's wisdom. The difference is how many deductions can you make from a wisdom literature, from a philosophical statement, from a scientific statement, and from a mathematical statement. You can make a lot of deductions from a mathematical description because that's its fucking purpose, right? With science, you can make quite a few second order, third order, fourth order deductions from a scientific rule, right? I mean, we do lots of them. From philosophy, you can sort of build a model that you can make decisions from. But wisdom literature isn't structured to depend on your reason. It's just structured to depend on your intuition. So you can't make these second and third order derivations from it. God said this, therefore this, whatever. You would say, God gave the advice or the command of blah, 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 blah. And my faith is under that wisdom, I would follow this advice, right? So the problem I get with is when they try to argue against science, evidence, and testimony, because what they're doing is they're not being Christian. They're actually using force and violence and deceit. And so if you have to make coercion, you're violating the entire fucking concept of Christianity, which is it's through love and seduction, not persuasion and coercion. And so my problem is, why are you trying to use persuasion and force on me? You're not trying to show me love.
Where's the love, man?
It's just love. There's nothing else fucking to it. So when I say lying, that's what I mean. If you're using Christianity as coercion rather than seduction, you're not a Christian. So don't argue with me about theology because you're taking a tool beyond its domain. I will quote stuff in the Bible. I mean, it's like, dude, that's, you're being the snake. Your snakes, so there's, Noah built an ark for a reason. I mean, we all can use that. So that's like the wisdom level. And then there's the love level, which is the whole point of his teaching, is that the only way to deal with the world, which is he's proxying to the Romans, like women proxy to men, like Jews proxy to white people. He's proxying the laws of the universe, right, outward. And he's saying the only way we survive the laws of the universe is love, by taking care of each other. It's actually the right fucking answer. There's no other answer. There is no other answer because you can't materially come up with resources. But love is fucking cheap. It's like kindness is free. People ask me like, why are you so nice to people all the time? And I'm the kind of guy, I help a lady out to her car, lady out with her car, or I move the cart up or whatever. I'm always doing something. It's just because it's cheap. Give 200 hryvnias to a little old babushka selling vegetables, right? When it's like 5 hryvnias worth of vegetables and I tell her to keep the change. Well, I mean, it's $10. But for her, it's like she probably makes 60 or 80 bucks a month. All right, so it's a big deal for her. What did it cost me? Nothing. Made me feel fucking good. It made me feel Christian. Did I ask for anything? Did I try to persuade her? No. You just do. If you can't just do, you're not Christian. You're just trying to be selfish. You're trying to display dominance. You're trying to defend your misuse of Christianity. And so I just view them as liars and frauds. That's my argument, is that don't use Abrahamic method of deceit. In other words, don't use the means by which women undermine as a weapon by which to advance your religious dogmas. Either you can show me love and care and demonstrate you're Christian, or you're not, because you are what you do, not what you believe, despite the fact that all these hokey religions try to tell you you are what you believe, not what you do. But in Islam, they've collected all these laws in the Sharia law. These are not only via negativas, but you musts. It's a via positiva means of doing everything, which of course is really easy for morons to do, but it absolutely prohibits any future adaptation on top of those laws. Whereas our system takes the opposite. It only prohibits the negative and opens up the field of opportunities that aren't negative. I don't think most people know this, but the Indian scholars are doing a great job. I just want to take this tangent of showing that the primary reason Islam emerged in opposition to Christianity, because Christianity was the emergent dominant religion, is that the Byzantines merged law and religion. When the Byzantines made it law, that law of Roman law was too counter to the traditions of the Arabs. So it created too much incentives to do the same thing, which is to merge law and religion. Like I say all the time, Rome died with Western Empire. That shit that emerged in the middle with Christianity laid down as not a wisdom literature, but an attempt to unify church and state, that was the catastrophe of Christianity. In other words, the Christians didn't succeed in Byzantium, it's where they failed. And this is why I say, don't get the illusion in your head that religion matters. What matters is custom and law and tradition and group strategy. And religion either advances that or it doesn't. The minute you combine religion and law, which is why I'm an advocate, if any church survives, it would be the Orthodox, is that it didn't. It separates family and spirit from law and state. That division is exactly what's necessary between the masculine and feminine. It's one of the reasons I think they're not crazy.
Who's they?
The Orthodox, like the Eastern Europeans. The reason they aren't crazy is because they never created the demand for cognitive dissonance. The church made two mistakes. It merged law and religion, and then it tried to merge philosophy and religion. These are two attempts at monopoly, when the whole point is not. It's to keep the two things competing. State, force, and power and reality against spirit, family, and emotion. That competition is necessary to maximize discovery, innovation, adaptation, and evolution. And the law is just the means we mediate that so that neither one takes control. Except that everybody wants a monopoly so their faction can have control. I tell people, stop looking at the Middle East for anything other than what not to do. They're the recipe for what not to do. India succeeded with myth and caste. China succeeded with philosophy and state. Europe succeeded with empiricism and law. We succeeded. Who failed? The Middle East failed. They're the only ones that failed. The fact that they got there first is just geographic, and that somebody up there in Anatolia invented the temple, right, which created basically the equivalent of a cave, which is a semi-spiritual experience if you ever go into one. Created a cave in which they could conduct the suggestion by suspension of disbelief. Well, since that charlatanism started there, the primary institution among these people was charlatanism. And they turned charlatanism into a means of social organization. The problem is they didn't understand what they were buying. China never made it. If you see China now, they're defending against the Uyghurs for a good reason. It's not that they're Uyghurs, it's that they're Muslims. And that shit is not going to get there. Indian nationalism is reemerging, not because of capitalism or communism, but because of Islam. Islam is a regressive cancer. Hopefully Islam went through its Reformation. It went through its Reformation in 1920. The difference is it went the wrong fucking direction. The same way that Christianity went through its Reformation. It went through its Reformation in Byzantium, and it went the wrong fucking direction. To some degree, Protestantism went through its Reformation. In other words, Christianity, and it went the wrong fucking direction. right? What we wanted was romanticism, not doubling down on this supernatural nonsense. What we want is the restoration of our ancestral religion, which incorporates, Christ as one of the gods, so to speak. In other words, that's the only, I don't know how to say it any other way, but we want that ethical construct to be brought into our traditional construct. We don't want to do what the Byzantines did. Well, what is the Marxist POMO, neo-Marxist POMO, PC woke, anti-Western, anti-white, anti-male tradition? It's a repetition of what the Christians did in the ancient world, and they took it down with them. Not so much that the Christians created the Germanic invasions, but the Christians prevented the rise of the aristocracy and the perpetuation of philosophy and reason. The same way that they destroyed all the arts and letters of the ancient world. And the same way they killed or ostracized all the philosophers. They had a reformation and it went the wrong direction. What happened subsequently? Well, Byzantium did the same thing. They doubled down and it went the wrong direction. So if you understand that the idea of Christianity, which is how to solve the problem of lifting up classes under Indo-European expansion so that the domesticated, semi-domesticated human animals could actually become humans and treated as such, that Christianity solved that problem. Would have solved it for the world. But by instituting Christianity as a legal system, right, by bringing the law into it, by mandating it, the Christians killed it. And they doomed Europe to a dark age. The Catholic Church could have corrected itself in the 1800s, but there was nobody like me to do that back then. And there needs to be someone like that in the Catholic Church. But the Orthodox at least didn't go wrong. They maintained Orthodoxy as a nationalist religion for a people, for the benefit of the people, in partnership with the state. They maintained this equilibrium. And this is a better way of doing things. It just is. Now, in our world, we could reunify state and religion like the Romans and our ancestors did prior to Christianity. We could do that, but it would require that we taught a form of mindfulness that was equivalent of hero worship across the archetypal spectrum, so that some of us could imitate Christ mostly, and some of us least, and some of us Caesar or Alexander mostly, or some of us Aristotle mostly. And if we have that spectrum, then we give people a portfolio that maximizes our social, political, personal, and discovery, innovation, adaptation, and evolution. But everything everybody wants, because they're not defended against enemies, is they want a monopoly. To me, I've done the best I can do, because I've provided a path for the church to claim victory, for Christians to claim victory, but the cost is the abandonment of the female method of warfare by the social construction of false promise, baiting people into hazard as a means of achieving mindfulness by abandonment of responsibility for the world around them. And so, in other words, what do women do? They don't take responsibility. They shove political responsibility on men. What do Christians do? They don't take responsibility. They shove responsibility onto the aristocracy, except we killed our aristocracy. Who was instrumental in carrying on our aristocracy? The same people behind Bolshevism, between the French, the feminism, the Bolsheviks, the Leninists, the whole. So that's the same method, is that they're rebelling against males, because from the female mind, the male is the proxy for the laws of the universe. Christians are a female cult rebelling against the laws of the universe.
The book of John talks about this logos. The ancient Greeks talk about logos, and it's the second word of the ancient Greek translation of the Bible.
Yes.
And it's like this, and John reflected that in his work. And he equated Christ as the logos, Jesus as the logos. It is the acceptance of the word of God that is necessary to move forward, which is the practical order of the universe. That is what you're talking about.
If you're female.
How's that?
If you're female. In other words, the God they're talking about and the submission he demands is the female interpretation of the male. See, that isn't true of European gods. We don't submit to them. Europeans discovered the primacy of man. They did it through techne.
Yeah, techne is the first Greek word of the Bible.
Right, but again, what do they always do? They take a truth and they wrap it in lies. How do they appropriate our language today?
No, it's like-
The same way they appropriated the language in the past.
So now
Do-
I'm objecting a little bit here because the issue is this. So you asked me this question before, which is why I choose to look at the ancient Hebrew of the Bible instead of the ancient Greek. And I will answer this question for you. Anything written can be misinterpreted for whatever purpose. A true thing can be perverted in time by misinterpretation. It goes like this. It's like I look to the ancient form to understand the form. And what does it tell me? As a matter of fact, not as a matter of subsequent misinterpretation over centuries and millennia.
You have a key point there. Say that again.
When I look at the ancient Hebrew, I'm not interested in modern interpretations or the 2,000 years of subsequent interpretations. I'm interested in what does it tell me now as a matter of fact. And that's what's interesting to me, and I don't care about anything else. And that's okay. I had some work that I did on my interpretations of words through the lens of Hebrew as I interpret it by a biblical scholar who specializes in ancient Hebrew or in the Hebrew interpretations. And he told me that I was just flat wrong. And I'm like, he doesn't agree with my interpretation, and I don't care. And I don't grant him any authority to say that it's not correct. I don't care what he has to say because it's like, go count beans in the corner. I don't care how many beans you count in your corner for how many years or eons. I don't care. I am doing my work over here and it's distinct from your work over there. And I don't care if you say I'm wrong. It doesn't bother me in the least place because I gain value out of what I
Yeah, I was
get.
going to say that he's confusing wisdom literature with scientific analysis, right? The purpose of wisdom literature is what you just described. The purpose of wisdom literature, which is really what, if you take ideology, philosophy, and theology and mythology, and literature, and you just or even history, and you throw them into some sort of into a category, that's wisdom literature. In other words, what can we learn from those who came before us?
Right.
The better the wisdom literature, the longer it survives. In other words, Confucius is pretty good, the Bible is pretty good, etc. So the point with wisdom literature is exactly what you said. What do I get out of this? That's why it's durable. The problem is when you get a lot of scholars, they get overly wrapped up in what did it mean at the time, or what does this mean given the vastness of my knowledge, versus how does it function in transferring meaning between generations.
Right.
And so you're just describing the importance of wisdom literature. So
That's different. No, I don't. I think that I'm distinguishing. There's a further distinction which I'm parsing out, which is this: is I don't grant authority to those who claim authority over interpretation of the wisdom literature, over my ability to interpret what I.
No, I get you.
But it's like the issue is the second.
If they could, it wouldn't function as wisdom literature. In other words, the whole point is it's not concrete enough. It's supposed to consist of general rules within a paradigm that produces a set of social outcomes, right? I mean, that's the reason for institutionalized religions. It's the reason for philosophy, whatever. It's just that the more precise you get, European science, the less durability it has. The more mythical you get, the more durability it has. So the reason things exist as wisdom literature is because they're general enough rules for contextual interpretation, regardless of context, that still produce meaning, in other words, opportunity for individuals who use it. So that's why wisdom literatures survive, is, they're good. The thing is that's why I say you can't discount the need for religion, the need for a mythology, the need for philosophy, because these things are different levels of precision over different periods of time. So yeah, to say authority over it, it's more like, well, others have interpreted this passage this way, but there's no authority to a rule of thumb that's its entire purpose is to be a maximally adaptive. It just doesn't make it, it's just clownish, right? It's one of the reasons, and I had this discussion with a philosopher when I don't know, back in might have been the early 20s. He was somebody who was very complimentary to me at the time. very a master of the world religions. I mean, he wrote a program that compared phrases, words and phrases from all the major religions. He's a very smart guy, right?
Wow.
He's very, and what's disturbing is he had memorized them all. Like he could memorize, he had memorized all these. I mean, there's no book he can't quote from right off the top of his head, because in the process of spending years at this analysis, whatever. But it doesn't matter what world religion he was quoting from, he could do it. He's a very strange character, by the way, but brilliant.
He's studying the reverberations of human consciousness throughout these various wisdom literatures, it seems.
Yeah, and the function of wisdom literature is just that. It would be no good if it was precise enough that you were in a different context, in a different generation, and not getting the same just about meaning from it. So there's no authority to scripture, I mean, basically wisdom literature. The more authority there is.
Oh, you're misinterpreting my.
No, I know. I'm not misinterpreting you. I'm riffing off your idea, which is I understand perfectly well that you don't give a shit what somebody else thinks. It doesn't put any constraint on your interpretation. My point is that the guy, any scholar who's coming, it's like people who are scriptural fundamentalists. Well, that's not what this book is for. Right. This book is not for deduction. It's for transfer of wisdom. The minute you try to turn it into reason, you get to what Plato did, which is form this goofy bridge between reason and theology that turns out to be a bunch of nonsense.
Interesting.
So the point. Well, so the point of wisdom literature is not to use it for deduction; it's to use it for application. When everybody says it means this, here are the 3,427 different meanings people have interpreted to this. And of this field, I mean, it's like fucking an algorithm, right? The field of numbers produced by this particular equation has all these possibilities to it. And it's somewhere, but in general, it covers this field. Well, of these 3,000 interpretations of it, some bit of wisdom is probably extractable from the field for you, right?
Right.
And that wisdom, this is where Canadian psychologist that's famous that we all like to quote. Peterson. I complain about his preservation of Semitic mythology, but the way he uses it is the way it's meant to be intended, which is for suggestion.
Yeah. But
he doesn't use it for deduction. This is my whole problem with fundamentalism. If you treat it as wisdom literature and that it's divinely inspired, right? Right? It's true. It's when you try to argue with it that you're trying to increase the precision of a thing that is not capable of second order effects.
It's so interesting because it's necessarily imprecise.
It's no value if it's precise. It's like, we have all these freaking recipes and equations and formulas only to expire them in the next generation because we've increased the level of precision. Well, you can't just anchor. Like, the point of wisdom literature is it's intergenerational across the civilizations.
This points to these Bolsheviks, okay? Which is they do produce something that's specific, and they necessarily have to, when it expires, create a new one, a new set of lies to project into the populace to control them, which is that's the objection. Okay, I'm good.
It doesn't solve the problem of resistance and objection and fragmentation, right? It doesn't. I can't solve that problem. All I can say is that we don't need to agree.
We're in agreement. We are in agreement with that. I
can take the wisdom of Jesus of Nazareth and I reduce it to 5 points, and I will behave just like I'm supposed to. That's it. But I don't need to know anything else. But because I don't have the need for mindfulness from some other source. But as people increase the mindfulness, they need to find some other way. My point is that we have plenty of ways of teaching people that mindfulness and Christianity, right? Just like we can teach them science and reason and law and economics and Christianity. But the point here I'm saying is, if you do that, Christianity is now a science. Because, right, this is the thing. It's true. At the level of first principles, it's true. The problem is, like wisdom literature, so anyway, that's the best I can do. I mean, I can't do anything else, but I mean, if I was, as a person myself, I was pretty happy with that conclusion.
Yeah, I think there's nothing to be unhappy about there.
But I haven't malinvested my status in something, so. I did that, right? I did it, just,
Now your response.
I just.
All right, man. People will do whatever they want. They self-determine by self-determined means, right?
And you know what? I love being around Christians.
Yeah.
Right? I love them. They're wonderful. On the other hand, when the king says show up and fight, you show up and fight. I know who I am, and I know the role of the aristocracy. If Christianity doesn't have the aristocracy, it's just Islam. I always go on Islam. You don't like it, but I always go on Islam. Their whole thing is drag it to the bottom where we're all equal. That's what Islam does. It drags everybody to the bottom into equality. It's a war against the tribal leaders who were, if you look at, there's got to be a video on Arabs before Islam. I'm sure there is. It's got to be a video or a lecture on Arabs before Islam. Right. And when you realize that this is a really barbaric group of people in a really barbaric territory where the chieftains maximize their barbarism, their extractions, instead of maximizing trade and cooperation, which is the interesting question, then you understand why there was such a demand for Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, because it was fucking horrible. In no small part because our religions, of course, are the origin of the Lenin strategy, which is to create an excuse for the indiscipline of the underclass in order to create a resistance movement against the empiricism of the middle and upper class. In other words, faith is a revolution that seeks to suppress the evolutionary velocity of the middle and upper classes and leaves the underclasses behind. So the problem is, of course, our religions all seek to justify, Christianity, the most among them, seeks to justify the expansion of the underclass as a means of destroying the European upper classes. Whereas what we want, of course, is the opposite, is we want to care for people who are good. In other words, there's nothing wrong with them as humans, right? They're not unwilling to cooperate. They're not out to do harm. They just can't perform. And as a failure to perform, we need to take care of them, but they can't continue their genetic line if their genetic line has turned out to be a cost on others. And this is the kind form of eugenics, which is just preventing dysgenics. That's the difference between eugenics, as I talk about it, which is negative eugenics, and positive eugenics, which seeks to punish people.
Yes, that's a important point. That was a good bit right there. Because you're
going to avoid it, huh?
No. I'm going to dance around a little bit first. It's like I wanted to appreciate that that political. The fact is that science has political conclusions to it is interesting. The conception of eugenics in a positive and a negatives that was interesting because it's like you talk about the issue of Christianity. It seems there is a suggestion of a moral obligation, which is the Leninists take advantage of, because it's like, if you're going to be true to what you said you claim to believe, then you are obligated to do what I say.
Exactly.
And it's like, yeah, that's not correct.
So The Wizard of Oz was written by Frank Baum. Frank Baum is Jewish. He's part of the children's story counter-revolution against the European and Germanic fairy tale majority. If you look back at our history, we tell still children's stories. What do those children's stories tell you? They tell you to be skeptical of all other people, which is to always look for incentives, which is what you find in the Greeks. They tell us to think in terms of being prince and princess, which is to have resources but responsibilities, despite the context. And we have ghost stories, which are basically moral analogies for the things we don't predict that are outside of our realm. So what did we get? We got Dr. Seuss. What is Dr. Seuss doing? Infantilizing. He's avoiding telling all those things. Well, what is Frank Baum doing? This original ruby slippers are silver. They're
Right.
money,
Right.
right? And so he was talking about you want to have money so that you can be independent of the morals, norms, and traditions and the wants and needs of all these other people who have other interests. But what he's really saying is you want to avoid paying costs of the commons. I just ruined the Wizard of Oz for everyone. Once you understand, if you go to Eastern Europe, especially Russia, Ukraine, but if you read children's stories, they're still princess, farm animals, skepticism. They're still European. They're still pagan. We know that, like, you have to look at Aesop's fables and some of the other things and learn what's been Christianized, because the Christianized ones are always lying. They're always telling you something's good. There's always saying Deus Machina will save you. Whereas if you go into the ancient Germanic, especially Celtic, because we have records of them, you're doing a lot of rituals that are meant you. My favorite one's a well one, which is a very specific, a very great instance of it, because I've written about this one before, is that they're telling you to do all these rituals in order to make sure you maintain your discipline. So just like these Christian guilt, right? In a promise, the Celts, the Germanics, the proto-Christians, pre-Christians, were using spirits, fear of spirits, as to do exactly the same thing. So my favorite one is that you're supposed to do these a woman should do these rituals before going to bed. And it's do these things with your doorstep and your food and all this other stuff. Where to hang your clothes, right? They're all meant to make you healthy,
Right.
preserve the health and welfare of your population. If not, the evil will get into your house at night. But they're all health and welfare. And then when she fails, she goes to the well and she prays to the well, the spirits of the well. Well, spirits of the well for the underworld, etc. That's where the dead live, and it's like that, for wisdom. But the point, I won't go through this story again. But the point of this thing is that the same process is used to indoctrinate us into questioning, into appealing to the fears in our intuition, to perform behaviors. What I'm saying is that we should not dismiss the incredible importance of Aesop's fairy tales, Grimm's.
Yeah, I've got Grimm right back here. I got it in my shelf because I'm like,
Yeah, this is and
fascinating.
that history is what they're undermining. And Dr. Seuss is part of the vanguard. That's what Sesame Street, honestly.
Yes.
Undermine the tradition of train your children right away to be princes and princes of their home.
I noted this occurring with my wife was giving my two children, they're called Bionicles. It's toys, but they come prepackaged with their own mythos. And I'm like, that made me real upset. And it's like, because I wanted to burn them and throw them out of my house, because it's like, I regard it as spiritual displacement or psychological displacement, because it's like, it's coming in and it's taking a place in my kid's mind. And I don't know what it's doing here, and I don't trust it.
This is why we had laws against Saturday morning cartoons being commercialized, right, in toys, etc. We were wrong to remove those. I only see it in retrospect, because at the time I'm like, this is fine. But it's only fine in the beginning when you're already indoctrinated into the prior.
Right.
But once you haven't been indoctrinated into the prior, I mean, I remember getting up and watching Davy and Goliath, which is, Christian lesson early in the morning. And I thought that was pretty good. That's pretty good stuff. But of course we had Hercules, right? We had all these heroic guys that were doing good, and Superman and all this other crap, right? But I grew up with that in Walt Disney, which is just Germanic fairy tales, right? So we forget that these are the core value systems of the country, of the civilization. And that if you don't have them, the Christian values are no good. Because the Christian value is just Semitic. So now if you take out the Christian values and the Germanic values and leave them with woke, which is just pure Semitism, you're in the worst of all possible worlds.
Just listening to you, and you're right. But it's like this. You're using archaic terminology, which has been already cast aside, talking about men and women like they're real. It's just a funny damn thing. It's like this. You have like 75 houses because there's so many genders. I mean, it's just like...
Yeah, let's put this in correct context. The devil's greatest skill was not in convincing people he didn't exist. It was in convincing you he was God.
Okay.
Yeah, the devil. Well, the problem is Pandora is the devil.
I'm not arguing. I don't know what that means exactly. Like, okay, that's too metaphorical.
Abraham is the devil.
Maybe. I'm
No.
not here.
Abraham is the female. The female is the devil.
I don't know how to process that. I don't know what I'm not even going to be aghast.
Well, the devil doesn't use war. He's not Zeus or Alexander or Tyr. How does the devil work? By undermining. Abraham is the devil. Jehovah is the devil. The devil seduces. He baits into hazard, right? That's female. The devil is female. Jehovah is the devil because Jehovah uses Abraham as the prophet of the devil because that's the female strategy of undermining. Decent morals. I mean, it's my argument about, I hope nobody hates me on this, but it's my argument about Southern Black people. If you meet Southern Christians, Baptists, Black Baptists, okay, I love those fucking people. Morality first. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to be a good person. You just have to do what the Bible says, right? It's not even complicated. It's exhaust love and forgiveness and forego all aggression. That's it. There's nothing else to it. Is it hard to make a human being do that? To surround a human being with enough other people doing the same thing to make that person intuit that works? Well, yeah, but it works. So I'm like, a dumb Christian is better than a good almost anything else for society. Once you know it's possible to make a person do what's counter to human nature by surrounding him with essentially familial love in a social context, you extend familial love to the social group. And it's just a ritual that keeps it reinforced in place, right? You just ritualize the process of this until it becomes the norm among the people. It doesn't matter that their average IQ is 85 because they're acting like people who have an IQ of 105 socially. That just works. You can prepare people psychologically for participation in an advanced economy, which is really what Christianity does, right? I mean, it basically makes everyone a customer. I mean, that's how you treat them. Christianity will advance you faster in the middle class majority than any other system we have. Christianity and a rule of law will create the framework that will make it possible that once you're at that ability of treating everyone with kinship love and treating everyone as a customer, that your group can organize large-scale organizations to vastly increase productivity. It's like how to win friends and influence people. Seek to understand, seek to serve, seek to help.
Right.
Now, Jesus, what does Christianity teach you? Same fucking thing. That's what I'm like saying. If you take all the shit out of Christianity and reduce it to its basic principles, it's just science. It's cognitive science. It's brilliant, which is why I say I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And so they are willing to entertain things that they would not have entertained 2 years ago. It's specifically related to Christianity. And it's like this, because I've talked to people that they're believers, but they're like, there's so much fake, manipulative Christianity that they don't recognize it as real. It's like so shallow Christianity, and specifically talking about believers, that's Christian believers who believe the mythos of, I don't have to do anything because I'm saved, because the promise. And it's like, they recognize that as, that's nonsense. There's just work here. We got work to do, and that's what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to be saved and not working.
Yeah, and it angers the shit out of me.
Why so?
Because it's the exact opposite of what Jesus said. And that's my problem with most what I see as fundamentalist Christians. They're trying to compensate for lower status by claiming higher status they don't have through fundamentalism, or they're trying to escape integration into society and the costs of paying for the cupboards. It seems like everybody that's in the proactive side of the community is harmful. Everybody that's in the institutional side of the community is a parasite or destructive. And the only people that are really doing good work are the ones that are out there to, they're doing charity work. They're saving people who are at the fringe, which I just love all of those people with all my heart. They're doing acts of personal charity, not monetary acts, but they're actually doing things. Or the people who are actually treating Christianity as a necessary institution for the production of generations of children. If you're not doing those things, if you're arguing dogma, that means you're not a Christian as far as I can tell. It's just acts. There's 5 rules to Christian behavior, and that's all there is. There's nothing else. And all we're doing is producing a set of oaths to take, which are the primary prayers. We're producing a ritual, which is a sacrifice, which is the communion. And we're producing a social order, which reinforces the fact that we all put our weapons away. Not only weapons of war, but weapons of undermining. In other words, Christianity is essentially telling you all acts of aggression are prohibited. This isn't true in any other religion. So I just love it. I just want it to be scienced.
Tough crowd.
It's a tough crowd for unchristian reasons. I'm not sure that the fundamentalists matter. What I think matters is the people who are behaviorally Christian and want a reason for it. In other words, they want to understand why their intuitions are correct. And the science of it is pretty simple. It's the optimum solution to the cooperation, which is the optimum solution to the prisoner's dilemma. The common law evolved before the development of mass media. And while it contained libel and slander and fraud, they didn't really have this concept of social construction of false promise by mass media. In other words, they had the concept of the pulpit and that the pulpit might do harm. And they had the concept of the printing press. And really, there was no debate over the right to bear arms. It was obvious. But there was a lot of debate over freedom of the press because they were afraid of this. They didn't know how to state what was true. In other words, they didn't really have the idea that these kind of political scams were possible, despite Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire being published. They just couldn't envision that the Christian destruction of the ancient world could be repeated in pseudoscientific terms, the modern world. And so they had no way of, and they didn't prohibit against fraud at scale. In other words, the social construction of false promises, freedom from physical, natural, and evolutionary laws. And they didn't have the thing of baiting into hazard. Where they did consider it, they ran up into the same problem I did, is that our religion baits you into hazard. Our Catholic Christian religion baits you into hazard, if only because of the promise of life after death, which was unwarrantable and unrestitutable, but it isn't necessarily analogically wrong. And the idea that you would treat people with Christian love is scientifically true. The problem is it isn't infinitely scale. So they were trying to continue the Germanic tradition without guarding it against the frailties in Christianity, which is it's fundamentally a globalist and communist religion. So there was no way to defend against it. So just like I have a problem in articulating, baiting people into hazard. I had to work on Christianity for a couple of years to figure out how to solve this problem. They probably couldn't have solved it in their era. They couldn't have figured out how to prohibit this kind of fraud without imposing upon Christianity. And they viewed Christianity as, of course, the Greeks viewed it, which is a way of controlling the peasantry, of domesticating the peasantry.
So in other words, the suggestion here is that it was useful to their social ends as it was. And
the answer is they had no way of anticipating the industrialization of lying by the Marxist, postmodernist feminists. They had no way of knowing that this would get out of hand, or that the hole they left in the Constitution that allowed baiting into hazard would be exploited by the Marxist, postmodernist, neo-Marxists, etc. There's a concept in software called graceful failure. What you want to do is since computational systems aren't like humans, they can reach uncomputable, they can become into an uncomputable state. So you have a way of degrading the software to accept the next level of abstraction and degrading the software to the next. So you have this graceful failure from high precision to low precision. And this comes out in a basically a stack report of where this failed and why. Well, the same thing is true in intuition, tradition, norm, reason, philosophy, science, right? It's that same increase in precision at the cost of failure. In other words, as I get a very specific high context rule and a very general low context rule. So the typical argument is if you're a general and you don't know what to do, if you follow the Bible, no one will shoot you. It's a graceful failure. So there's a graceful failure back to theology. And there's a graceful increase in precision up to logic, then science. The way to look at this is just like we look at age. You start out young and you're very selfish and you have to learn norms, and you do this by basically punishment in the beginning. And then you do it by imitation of your parents, then you do it by general social rules, then you do it by basic norms, then you get educated, you do it by certain rules, then you learn it by certain logics, then you learn it by certain sciences. And so you mature from the whatever. And now with an interesting result, of course, it's actually a circle. You end up with wisdom at the end because you've covered enough edge cases to be able to start wisdom. Well, that's what theology tries to provide, is in the most general rules for solving the largest number of edge cases for the people with the least information. Whereas science requires, this is what I get, problem people have with my work, is that it requires a vast amount of knowledge of a vast number of fields that can only be accumulated over vast periods of time with vast amounts of effort that nobody wants to spend because they want to just be happy in the interim. So this cycle works. It's not like it's just an endpoint. It's continuously, recursively disambiguating the human knowledge space. That's why you have to update theology every now and then. The problem is, because theology is the least rationally constructed, which is a value to it, it's extremely difficult to update it without a reformation. And just like group strategies, they don't appear to be able to be updated, even though we've tried. It's almost impossible to change a group evolutionary strategy. It's next to impossible to change a theological framework or mythological framework, because of course it's dependent upon that strategy. Besides the fact it's non-rational. One of the values of faith and magic and whatever the stuff is, because it's not rational, it's not open to criticism. I'm just able to say it's the faith, and I can't be put in the position of lower status because I'm not as knowledgeable as you are. Basically, one of the values of having a book, which is what we're trying to create here, a book, is that you say it's faith. It's true. It's God-given word. I don't have to argue with you. Whatever you say, you can only be trying to dissuade me from the true path of God. So that there's a value in that imprecision and absence of reason. Conversely, science is continuously falsified, and so it's continually stressful. So in this sense, it's better to look at things as a cycle of continuously recursive disambiguation, with science as the leading charge and religion as defense. You see this is how religion is used. It's used as defensive measure, right? Okay. Islam combined them both to make them offensive and defensive. But of course, the result was, if you do that, since religion is defensive, you regress rather than progress. So what you want, of course, is a stable equilibrium between the science moving forward, the norms and philosophies in the middle, and the theology at the end. Unfortunately, the stable equilibrium is created by a stepping function. Here's the threat. The threat of any devoted is status. They have their confidence and status obtained by the same method the left is trying to create again, which is reality by chanting. In other words, social construction. And so since their status comes from a social construction of a wisdom rather than a truth. This tends to make them maladaptive. And so the problem is it a threat to your status can only be offset by, well, you were right.
That's right.
But in order to say you were right, in order to gain the comfort of saying you were right, you have to say, well, you're right, but now you got to pay the cost of adaptation to prove you're not wrong. It's not like they haven't done this. There's probably Paul, whoever wrote the original gospel after that, Mark or whatever. Is it Mark? Which one wrote the original one? Whoever wrote the original gospel, right? And the fucking 20 imitators that got whittled down to 4 or whatever it is. And then the people in the church who over time embellished this narrative.
Yes.
And wrapped it in Jewish theology at a great objection, by the way. Had it maintained the New Testament, it would have been fine. The New Testament's fine. The Old Testament's got to go.
My.
What?
I said, oh my.
So, well, as you know, who said this? Joshua. The person that's most like me is Joshua Block. He said,
I said, my.
he says it's the dreams of a child, the childhood dreams of a God.
That's interesting.
Which is fucking genius, because it is the childhood dreams of a God. It is childhood dreams. It's a mythology for children. It's fucking beautiful in that sense. The problem is it's an evil fucking God. You know?
How is that? Please define that for me.
Jehovah, he's a fucking evil son of a bitch. He's horrible. What he's saying is your typical Middle Eastern despot that conquered one people after and subjugated one people after another, right, is the prototype for a god. The Indo-European god is a dysfunctional family that, despite their dysfunctions, defeats the forces of nature. You were trying to make a point. My point was that the evolution from the original fairy tale made by because it's increasingly looking like this guy didn't exist. Right. So the original fairy tale made by Paul, it was probably some event. It might have been a person. That's right. That allowed them to convert the idea of that Paul was bringing from Jewish literature, from basically an angel, into a personification of this guy Jesus, and then to embellish the story, which then got repeated in 1,000 different ways and winnowed down to 4 different cases. But there's we probably one of them was original. And then this was brought into the empire. Just as Jews work on Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, PC woke, anti-whiteness, they did the same thing with the Jesus mythos. And they built a resistance movement, an underclass resistance movement out of it. And so that's what they did. Now you see that that's the process. However, what happened was it got powerful enough that the Romans said, well, we can try to keep administering these people with rule of law, or we can just give them what they want, is this stupid shit. And so we can follow the rest of the earlier world, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the Levantines, etc., into managing this vast peasantry with this comforting lie. And this gives us dominion over them as the adjudicators of this lie. So that's what they did. They formalized it at Nicaea, right, into a sort of dogma. And then the Catholic Church incrementally basically got rid of it over century by century, first by saying, well, we have to, now that that's happened, we have to deal with the reintroduction of Greek reason because we can't defeat it. So you had Augustine, and Augustine brought in a synthesis. Then we went through the Dark Ages, and due to the fact that the Muslims went fundamentalist, the Muslim scholars fled to the West, where there still was free thinking, and they brought with them the restoration of the Greek methods, primarily among them Aristotle. And so this ended up to the Aquinas Reformation, which ended up in the Scholastics, which is basically natural law. So they had incrementally been terrified by the restoration of Greek knowledge, but in the end, they had to accommodate it, so they formed a synthesis. The synthesis, which is Athens versus Jerusalem, isn't really a bad idea. It solves the fundamental problem of a primarily underclass civilization like the Semitic Middle East and a primarily aristocratic upper class and upper middle class civilization of Europe. So this unification brought in the peasant thinking, the peasant god, in with the aristocratic gods. And this is important for some reason, because as European civilization developed, it was really a tribal civilization with everybody was a military. In other words, the entire civilization, the entire polity was militarized. In a military polity, you always have status regardless of rank, right? But in a commercial economy, you don't. And so when this got expanded, the Europeans came down into the Mediterranean, which is primarily Anatolian farmer stock, and conquered them. When the Europeans conquered some Europeans, they did so as a conquering aristocracy, the way they'd conquered other domesticated animals. And so the problem is, once you built, the Athenians chose an economy and the Spartans didn't. We tend to think of Europeans as being the Athenians, but that's not true. The Europeans were the Spartans. The Spartans were continuing the European tradition, right? Military aristocracy over a conquered people. The Athenians, however, built ships for trade, which turned them into the English, just like the Spartans remained the Germans. So the Athenians built ships, they built commercial economy. Now they had to adapt all this stuff. And because what was happening is they needed those lower people as independent workers. And as they conquered more and more people, they needed a way to move. Well, nobody wants to be a shit in a domesticated animal, right? So you have to find status somewhere. Religion makes it possible to have status of the mind without status of material, political, military, or verbal. And so religion is the lowest cost way of developing mindfulness from status. It takes nothing.
Right.
Nothing at all, except sort of denial of reality. It's so funny.
That has to be edited out.
And a super, not quite supernatural in India. The Europeans were really more about magic. And you see this through the resistance to Christianity throughout, is that even in the 10th or 11th, 12th century, you still have magic. I mean, I grew up in an era where the magic was, I was still Germanicized where I grew up, because it was a very Germanic community. And, I still interpret right up and through Tolkien, the influence of magic against religion. These are two different views of the world. Religion is subservience and magic is power. The reason is, of course, Europeans are primarily metalsmiths, are weld the devil, the demon to the anvil sort of thing, right? And so we think in terms of the magic that was important to us, which was military, not the magic that was important to governments, which was supernatural. And so we built this different society based on very small premises. This is where I get kind of weird with Christianity. I mean, it's a beautiful lie. And it happens to produce the great behavior. Unfortunately, half of the externalities, the fundamentalist externalities, are a problem. Whereas as wisdom literature, as philosophy, it's fucking brilliant. It's the same thing with Buddhism. If you read Buddha, it's pretty good in the original form. And Stoicism is pretty good in the original form. But we've been indoctrinated to think Abrahamic religions, which are the worst religions possible, are what religion means. They're not really. Islam isn't a religion. It's a revolutionary state. That's a conflation of all three axes of the triangle. The Chinese don't do that. The Indians don't do that. And we didn't do that. Even with Christianity today, we have separation of church, state, and law, or at least in America, we still have it.
We want a religion that outputs norms, given everything that's left over after law, right? After law eliminates the bad, we have this set of everything that's left. And we want a religion that turns that into norms that are ideal for the polity.
I'm going to state that from the opposite side, right?
Sure.
From the bottom up. I, as an individual, I need to be willing to pay costs of forbearance, even if I can't always see returns.
Yes.
That's really Christianity in a nutshell. Exhaustion of forbearance. The minute I can give up on you, I can. Well, that's like saying I'm exhausting my opportunity for cooperation. Well, what's the limit of cooperation? exhausting the opportunity for cooperation. So you're going to get more cooperation in a Christian society than you're going to get out of all others, because the underlying premise is simply science. Exhaust the opportunity for cooperation. Because under the prisoner's dilemma, eventually people figure it out. I mean, at least people who aren't terribly broken, figure out that in general, it's pretty much useful to forbear everything. And once you take that far enough, you start forbearing your own pettinesses. Right? And so it's an incredibly virtuous cycle, which is completely counterintuitive. I mean, our intuition is to remember every slight and to extract payment for it. But Christianity tells us to do the opposite.
Removed from the lies, yes.
Right? How can we teach that without all the other crap? Well, I mean, it's just the New Testament. You just put the New Testament out, and that's all there is necessary. The rest of it needs to go away. But I mean, there's really not much more than the New Testament, which is exhaustion of forgiveness. Just take it, and eventually we win.
If you listen to the original messages, forgiveness is an investment, not an excuse.
An excuse, correct.
That's all we're asking for people to do, is go back to where forgiveness is an investment, not an excuse.
You know, what bothers me is the prediction, and it sounds about right to me, that we'll enter a new age of religion. It certainly seems to be happening. I don't see that as a good thing. No. So I sort of view it as we need these center-left priests to understand they're priests, not scientists. I've never seen the Karen phenomenon, where women act like infants. I never saw that. I mean, I don't know when that first started happening, but it's been recent. It's a recent phenomenon.
I like to imagine that's how Christians acted in Rome.
Yes.
That behavior emerges in church when all the actual decision makers step back.
So the problem is the vaccine has nothing to do with the vaccine. I was taking the tack that they politicized the vaccine.
It's not just politicized, it's taken on the religious dimension. It's Christians trying to baptize the pagan kids.
So it's this idea of getting people away from ideal types. And of course, Christianity is our most influential ideal type. It's easier to think simple, so to speak. It's easier to do that. It's easier to wish everyone were equal, but it's just like you're reducing calculation to the lowest common denominator. I mean, that's really the purpose of all religion. They shut down conversation whenever it gets out of the approved paradigm, which they consider the approved frame, which is that they are not required to adapt, modify, or adapt. Once you can't communicate because the other people are in denial or they're in a religion, which is basically a form of denial. Now, the founders understood the problem of religion, the opiate of the masses problem, but they viewed it as necessary. So they couldn't outlaw superstitious prose. So that's why you get to this vague freedom of speech issue and freedom of religion. Because the natural conflict is that you'd have to eliminate religion, public religious speech. Well, nobody wants to do that. I don't even want to do that. We've almost succeeded in eliminating it, but then all we did is open the door for pseudoscientific religion instead. What's exemplified in Islam is everybody's at the bottom. Find some interviews of guys going to the Hajj and walking around the big black rock. We're all equal. This is the only place where no one is higher than other. But then they come off of like they talk about sovereign states and the same way they talk about rights, as if they're gifted from heaven rather than things we try to produce as norms and traditions and institutions. You know, it's like talking to libertarians, they're like fucking idiots. My favorite libertarian thing is, how can you demonstrate libertarianism or religion? Well, as libertarians, we believe that, okay, you just got into a religion. You didn't say what was. You could say instead that as libertarians, we would like to drive toward this ideal. That's okay. But you said the minute you say we believe that, I mean, it's just a freaking religion. And that's what I say. Marxism is underclass religion. Libertarianism is middle class religion. And neoconservative is upper class religion. But they're freaking religions because they're all universalist. I don't know why they work so hard at denying it. It's because they have to believe it's true. It's the same way that the religious have to believe it's true, right? They have to believe it's true to maintain group cohesion.
That's right. You have to behave in a manner that's consistent with the fact that you believe it's true. Even if you don't believe it's true and it's causing dissonance inside your head, it's like, that's what I think is shaking around, it's popping rivets loose around the edges. You know, because it's like you keep on pushing in information that doesn't make sense into the people's heads, and they're trying to conform and it doesn't make sense. And at the edges, they're falling off.
We just have too many guys that when they come back, it's just you go from where you have little choice, but that you have this camaraderie that can't be achieved anywhere else. You have that thing that is the origin of religion. That incredible inclusiveness. If you haven't served in the military, I mean, the military's changed a lot. If you go, at least you go back in history, that's a really binding. I mean, that's the origin of religion. Is organized religion is the initiatic brotherhood of warriors. You're going to resist that like crazy. Now, religion. Think about the resistance of fundamentalists. Because we don't think of it this way, but fundamentalism is really sort of a new thing. We know when it happened. It happened because of the beginning of the scientific revolution. So all these fundamentalist sects emerged in a certain period, a similar period of time as self-defense, because holy crap, I don't want to learn all this new stuff. I like my values and my stories and my parables. I don't like knowing their children's stories. I don't like that I'm being indirectly programmed. I like that I'm being indirectly, and I want to continue my status obtained from all the investment I've made in this. And frankly, I like how people behave. I mean, it's true. Ask all, like I know of other guys, we consider ourselves pagans, which is the sense that lionize heroes rather than. So they all say, well, Christians are just better to be around. No, we also say the same thing. You want to live around Christians, you just don't want to buy that nonsense. Or the same with Islam. You don't want to be around them and you don't want to buy their nonsense. You see, that's the trick, is none of us want to adapt. That's not really true, none of us, because we're not all malinvested in something that's outside of our control. But these people are. And so just as we can't defeat fundamentalism today, we can't defeat PC woke Marxism postmodernism, which is just a pseudoscientific revision of the false promises of theology.
But I would agree.
We can't defeat them. People don't want to adapt. This is important because taking it to the end logical conclusion, those people are frauds. In other words, they're committing act of fraud by not paying the cost of adaptation necessary to create the conditions under which they live. So in essence, it's not just that they're wrong or they've got to change, but that they're criminals.
Okay.
I was hoping I'd get more out of you than that.
Oh, it's like this. Yes.
So politically, this is the problem to overcome, is the problem of retaliation cycles. One of the things religions did is they provided a standard and mimetically transmissible form by the simplest form possible, which is anthropomorphism. They provided a narrative which functions as a system of measurement that prevented retaliation cycles. This is why religions, as we understand them as organized religions, emerged during the period of transformation, which was the increase in scale of population and cooperation and a response to the expansion of the agrarian revolution.
It's kind of an interesting power distance question too. So right now it's like in the current administrative state we exist in, there's quite a large distance between the person who's responsible for making the decision as to the claim of unable versus unwilling, as opposed to the church, which knows you and your behavior and has been watching you, and it's close power distance.
I like the argument because that's my argument for the necessity of the church. That's why church needs to be reformed, because the institution is necessary. And what's happened is they tried to make the school, the post office, and the library and the government try to function in supplying those, and they can't. You actually need extremely low power distance, which is essentially you need a parent, the church. You need somebody who's dealing with non-property assets.
What's non-property assets?
Immaterial assets. The way we used to do is church was the moral court, and then you had the property court, and then you had the harm court, and then you had the political court, and then you had the court of last resort, which was the king. You actually need those courts because you can't do anything functional under one standard deviation from 100. The barrier to actually being able to make inferential and consequential deductions, that's the reason you train people in religion, you train people in norms, traditions, and values, etc., is because 99% of what we do fits. And those two boxes, right?
That's right.
You
don't need to be, you don't have to use your brain much.
You just have to
behave like you were trained.
Yes.
You'll fall back into your training if you're stressed. It'll be okay. Boy.
They're all promising non-aggression. What they're really doing is it's almost an elaborate system of manners and norms.
Yes.
Told in stories. But the truth is it does produce non-aggression.
Right.
So, well, this isn't always true. Christianity is aggressively non-aggressive. Judaism is not. It's polyethical and polylogical. There's inside and out. Islam is all the way to the other extreme. It's 50% of the content, maybe 60% of the content of Islam is how to oppress outsiders. So you go from a via negativa, Christianity is the promise of non-aggression, to via positiva of aggression under Islam. So it's interesting to watch the evolution because really Christianity comes out of old Judaism, but rabbinical Judaism as practiced today comes out of Christianity in Greece, and Islam comes out of Christianity. Interesting to see the spread of Greek thought and the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic counter-revolutions against that kind of realism. Because the problem with that realism is it's pushing individual accountability down into you. It's pushing ownership for the commons into you. It's pushing responsibility into you. But what do Christianity and Judaism and Islam problem? What does Islam produce most of all? It's irresponsibility. God wills it. Praise be Allah. It's your life is foretold. Meaning you're not responsible.
An absence of agency.
Correct. And that's what it teaches, which is why they fell behind. Whereas Christianity says, I'm only responsible for those things the aristocracy isn't responsible for.
Right?
And that's why Christianity worked reasonably well as long as there was the martial aristocracy. It's the same thing that happened in America and in Europe. The minute we lost the monarchies, we lost the military aristocracy in favor of this middle class bullshit. They're all promising non-aggression. What they're really doing is it's almost an elaborate system of manners and norms.
Yes.
Told in stories. But the truth is it does produce non-aggression.
Right.
So, well, this isn't always true. Christianity is aggressively non-aggressive. Judaism is not. It's polyethical and polylogical. There's inside and out. Islam is all the way to the other extreme. It's 50% of the content, maybe 60% of the content of Islam is how to oppress outsiders. So you go from a via negativa, Christianity is the promise of non-aggression, to via positiva of aggression under Islam. So it's interesting to watch the evolution because really Christianity comes out of old Judaism, but rabbinical Judaism as practiced today comes out of Christianity in Greece, and Islam comes out of Christianity. Interesting to see the spread of Greek thought and the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic counter-revolutions against that kind of realism. Because the problem with that realism is it's pushing individual accountability down into you. It's pushing ownership for the commons into you. It's pushing responsibility into you. But what do Christianity and Judaism and Islam problem? What does Islam produce most of all? It's irresponsibility. God wills it. Praise be Allah. It's your life is foretold. Meaning you're not responsible.
An absence of agency.
Correct. And that's what it teaches, which is why they fell behind. Whereas Christianity says, I'm only responsible for those things the aristocracy isn't responsible for.
Right?
And that's why Christianity worked reasonably well as long as there was the martial aristocracy. It's the same thing that happened in America and in Europe. The minute we lost the monarchies, we lost the military aristocracy in favor of this middle class bullshit. They are morally tolerant, excessively morally tolerant, and that's because it's part of Christianity. Because it's part of Christianity, it's part of the Enlightenment and American mythos and the post-war mythos. So they're excessively tolerant, and their tolerance has been abused, and they need to realize that their tolerance has been abused. Not that they're bad people, right? Not for being intolerant, but their tolerance was taken advantage of. But we're not very good at protecting informal institutional property, norms, traditions, values, etc. We've gotten weak at that because the church was traditionally the guardian of it. Because the church held that position and the state held property. That's why we were able to survive Christianity, is the state maintained the jurisdiction over property and the church maintained jurisdiction over morality. Morality is what produces the institutions of cultural production, right? So the church ended up managing that institution of cultural production, at least on the educational side. That's not seduction, that's force. Whereas the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims have a spectrum of Christian seduction, Jewish utility, and Islamic oppression, another invasion. I get these emails, and it goes to the big question we're still facing, which is, Curt, hi, I follow you. I live in the Bible Belt in Missouri, and your talking parts are so in line with our people. You know, and I'm Christian, and I could sell this, but this whole emphasis on the Abrahamic method of deceit, our good people lose it there. They think, he says, Christianity conquered the world once. It's not really quite true. Probably not again, but I live in an abundance of strong men. In my opinion, your movement, I don't want a movement, can be huge. We just can't alienate the worker bees. If you can somehow soften the Abrahamic method more, people would get on board. Christianity has been so feminized in the world, but not in middle America. The Midwest is full of masculine men who would love to hear you, but we can't take their God out of the picture. Well, this is similar to what you say, right? Because I can see it in your eyes. See, I know you.
So what does it mean to you? That's the question.
My natural response is I've done the best I can do. I have provided a path for Christianity.
My impression is that your complaint is properly levied against whom the Christians would call the Pharisees, and improperly leveled against the Abrahamic followers that became Christians.
It's just, that would be false. What you could say instead is that there's just no way of getting around the fact that the feminine method of social construction, by the feminine method of seduction, by the feminine method of false promise, using the techniques that I've stated in excruciating technical detail, is the same whether it's in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, anti-male feminism, PC, woke, anti-Western, anti-white, anti-male. It's the same technique. So you can't say it's different because the technique is different. So when you say it's not, there are plenty of ways to approach the problem of providing people with mindfulness and organization and tolerance for the relative hostility of the world. But if you look at the techniques used, there are only so many techniques of coercion and so many techniques of warfare available. And the Abrahamic method is the institutionalization and cultural indoctrination of the female method of warfare. So if you want to say instead that if you took Jesus's words out, which don't include any miracles, by the way, And you simply said that he was a philosopher instead of letting him be captured by the inserted in the Abrahamic method, that whether prophet or philosopher, in other words, whether divine or man with divine insight, he correctly articulated the only means of accommodating the Indo-European discovery of the laws of nature and how to accommodate them rather than be victim of them. Then Jesus is correct that you are left with Jesus and God, and you are left with the Abrahamic method being a set of lies wrapped around this in order for it to sell in a world made of lies instead of a world made of truth. So whereas if I say Jesus is simply correct, it's the only way of doing it. There's no reason. There are three cases for God, the difference meaning nothing, and the basic Christian teaching is simply true, and that the church took this basic truth despite all the Semitic nonsense, and by attempting to integrate Jesus' teachings with Greco-Roman Germanic thought, we Germanicized Christianity to the point where by the 1800s we were very close and restoring our ancient religion with the Christian additive innovation and our ancient law with the rule of law by the natural law and the primacy of man. So it's obvious that that is a case. There's no way of getting out of it. You can't weasel out. So the problem is I've provided a path for Christians to claim they were right all along, because they were, but that they were deceived. The point is I can't lie. So all I hear is, as a prosecutor, I hear is, yeah, but I had good reasons for stealing.
Wait, who stole?
You're stealing from the informational commons. So wait. No, you just, there are sources of ignorance and sources of truth. This lie and this system of argument is very clearly, without exception, everywhere universally a source of ignorance, which is maladaptive and slows the rate of discussion. So every person who believes this falsehood and engages in the Abrahamic method of deceit is engaging in the feminine method of undermining of institutions of social production that produce the potential for continuous recursive innovation, adaptation, evolution. So you are stealing from the commons by propagating this lie. Now, early Christians who followed my work understood this was the logical consequence of it, which is why they ganged up on me. The logical consequence is that they have malinvested in a lie, and they are propagating a source of ignorance that's delaying adaptation. In our case, they're delaying our defense against hostile aliens because they're the ones who make it possible. So the source of our destruction was and remains the Christian ethic, just like the source of the Roman destruction was and remains the Christian ethic. So no, this is not a neutral proposition. This comforting lie is just a drug, just like heroin and nothing else, in order to claim irresponsibility while still pretending virtue. What these people are really doing is they're checking out. They're evading responsibility. They're destroying the informational commons. They're dragging our civilization into dark age like they have before. So no, I'm not going to give them a free pass. My fulfillment of my obligation to God as manifest in the laws of the universe is that I cannot tolerate any more lies. Lies that destroy and violate the law of nature. Well, the law of nature and nature's God. These Christians are not, in fact, Christians. All you have to do to be a Christian is to imitate Jesus, which is the exhaustion of hatred from the human heart, the exhaustion of forgiveness before ostracization, retaliation, or punishment, or worse, the personal acts of charity necessary to help others less beneficial than you, and in exchange, to obviate your responsibility for that which is outside your sphere of influence and competency. That is Christianity. There's nothing else to it. There doesn't need to be anything else to it. And all you have to do is that. Everything else you do is in order to pretend competency you do not have, because you're following the words of mystics written thousands of years ago who were the civilization most specialized in the production, distribution, and application of lying. in order to keep people in ignorance, subservient, so that a priestly caste could extract from them, just like the government extracts from us today. So I do not err. I just understand it's not my job, whether as scientist, philosopher, lawgiver, or prophet, whichever one of those it is, or all of the above, to continue to permit the very crime that produced the Dark Ages, destroyed 7 other civilizations of the ancient world, and persists today as attempting to destroy us today by what we call woke, but it's just Christianity version 2.
I was thinking of Constantinople.
Yes.
Constantine had a battlefield conversion, which is how Christianity came to the Eastern Empire.
He did not have a battlefield conversion. That was made up afterwards. What he did was his mother was a Christian who was persecuted. Napoleon's mother was persecuted. Genghis Khan's mother was persecuted, right? That's what produces men who do these things, right? This is the origin of everyone. I mean, it's freaking the origin of psychopaths. So if you look at this history, all he did was say, this works, right? This works because it allows us to not require aristocratic competency in order to manage the masses and extract from them. In other words, lying is cheaper than rule. So mothers versus fathers. How do mothers discipline? By seduction. That's everything a woman does to her children is produced by the act of maintaining a balance between seduction and influence. Well, what does the church do? The same fucking thing. What do these religions do? The same fucking thing. Well, what does law do? It's fucking costly. What does education do? It's fucking costly. What does training do? It's fucking costly. What does physical fitness do? It's fucking costly. Why do women use seduction? It is the least requirement for the fulfillment of a promise of all possible means of influence. That's it. This was the hard problem of social science. Religion is
Okay.
the hard problem. Once you science religion, you realize there is a necessary market demand for mindfulness. In order for people to form large groups, in order to develop standards of weights and measure for behavior in large groups, in order to create and to maintain and supply a group evolutionary strategy, capable of maintaining a division of labor such that we can continuously increase the consumption of and resistance of the laws of nature. So it's just, this is why they're necessary. The thing is, we don't need false religions. If we look at the world religions, Stoicism and Epicurus is the only non-false religion. Shintoism is the next most, or you could argue Chinese ritual is. It's possible for Chinese ritual. Then Shintoism, then Buddhism, then Hinduism, then Judaism, then Christianity, then Islam. So it's not impossible to serialize, disambiguate, serialize, operationalize the degree of falsehood and false promise each religion depends upon. Well, why does that hierarchy exist? Because the Middle East is a very fucking nasty place. Not because of anything other than the geography maximizes the opportunity for the concentration of production and the equal concentration of raiders. Right? Of course, Hermes and the cart of lies. Hermes is going to go around the world with this cart of lies. It's going to break down in the Middle East, and the Arabs are going to steal everything in the freaking cart.
The issue is, in your mind, Christian inaction is problematic.
Christian dogma is problematic. I'm not original. Jefferson did the same thing. Just pull out and write down, which is the Jeffersonian Bible, what Jesus said. Take all the Abrahamic crap out of it. You know what it is? It's a condensation of Persian, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian wisdom literature. This is why we're not sure he actually needed to exist other than as an archetype that all these ancient sayings were attributed to. The difference is He put it in a loving God, right? That's his innovation, a loving God, and therefore compelling us to love. This is his innovation. And if you just look at it as an innovation in social science, that's great. Or an innovation of philosophy, that's great. Or an innovation in theology, that's great. But the fucking guy was right. Whether he existed or not, whether he existed only as a germ, whether he's an evolution of Saul of Tarsus's sort of fictionalization, whether he's the result of many, many people attributing things to him, because all these gospels seem to have put through the sifter, right? The origin of most of it's Egyptian. The difference is it's a loving God, not a hateful Semitic God. And so just look at that and say, okay, that's the innovation. Well, if you want to be a Christian, I'm sorry, that's all there is, because that's all Jesus ever said that we know of that's even vaguely attributable to him. Everything else isn't Christian. It's something else. It's Jewish, it's Abrahamic, it's whatever, but it's not what the man said. It's the similar thing that happened to Buddha. Buddha wasn't a deist, right? He was just sort of like nature, right? But his stuff got abused over time until Buddhism became a bit of woo-woo. So those are the two most common examples. Look at the story of King Arthur. There's some germ of truth, Arturius there somewhere, right? But none of the rest of it's just piled on shit over centuries. Well, the same thing happened to the story of Jesus. The difference is they were piling on a slightly different thing, right? But the character of Arthur was Christianized. If you look at Aesop's fables, we can tell the difference between the original Greek and the ones that were added by Christians that aren't. We can tell the difference because Deus ex machina doesn't exist in Greek. It's all naturalism. In other words, things follow their nature, their predictions. So my problem is that I've done the best I can do. I found a way for Christianity to maintain as a religion. But in order to do that, we have to face the fact that just as our culture was appropriated, his words were appropriated. This is what they do. They take a truth and they wrap it in lies. And they use the truth to bait you into the harm that's created by the lie. And my opinion is that unless you could get a church to be so desperate, in other words, the Catholic Church to be so desperate to produce a reformed Christianity, there's just no way to get there and save the church. What'll happen is what we think of as fundamentalists today are going to be tomorrow's Mennonites. They'll use some technology, but they're still fundamentalists, right? This is where I see Christianity going. And I don't see there's no evidence that it's not going that way. The difference is we look at our Amish and our Mennonites and to some degree our Hasidim as great-grandparents.
Yeah, they're like fossils of consciousness or process.
Right, and that's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so to me, I would love to be able to go talk to Amish people, because I have, and not have them worry that I'm negatively judging them. And instead,
they're respectable people.
Right. I mean, I treat them as sacred.
Yeah.
And so to me, the Amish are sacred, like your elders, right? And they're keeping that alive. And I absolutely love that. I'm not too fond of Hasidim because of their association with organized crime, but I can understand them. You want these monastic communities to remember the purity, right? There's a point of purity in your underlying metaphysics, and they keep alive a sort of purity. So that's great, but that's only going to exist if the greater structure wants to keep that purity alive. What we see is that PC woke and Marxism this is an atheistic, materialistic, state-centered, globalist version that's actually even more destructive than Islam was. So I look at it as, well, what do I do? Well, I mean, I did the best I could. I'm not a chump. I scienced religion and I scienced Christianity. And it turns out that, God damn it, the church was right with natural law. Jesus is right with extending of love. And the Europeans are right on the primacy of man. Okay, fine. Just understand that those aren't opinions anymore. They're not opinions, right? This is just painful evidence of the hand of God, the universe, and the laws of nature. I view it as restoring or saving Christianity from its enrapture and lies that bait our people into hazard, producing a direct truth, which as a consequence produces their own destruction.
Now, you're going to fragment them. All groups will be fragmented. Some will be repelled and some will be attracted because of it.
I can't expect everybody to agree with everything.
That's
The
correct.
only thing they need to agree with is the right to self-determination is the only reason we don't have to conquer and oppress others is if they don't do the same. So if Christians want the right to self-determination by a Christian polity, then the law says they can. And what would happen is, of course, is that parts of, especially the Bible Belt, would institute Christianity as a state religion. They would just teach it, and it would probably be just fine. Whereas if you're going to have some atheist sort of dream world, which is sort of upper middle class fantasy, then go ahead. You'll just pay the price of it. They pay the price of it because you can't not satisfy the market demand for mindfulness in a market that puts the primary system of measurement of the human being, which is status, under continuous threat. So people are going to always and everywhere pursue some method of mindfulness that alleviates the stress of their mindfulness.